Somewhere beneath your feet, in the dirt and stone that make up the ground you're standing on, there might be the remains of a world that thought it would last forever. Not metaphorically, literally. Cities that had running water, complex governments, trade networks stretching thousands of miles, people who woke up every single day absolutely certain that their way of life was permanent. And then it wasn't. Here's an unsettling thought to sit with as you drift off tonight. What if we're not the first civilization to believe we're the pinnacle of human achievement? What if that feeling, the one you probably have right now, that things are basically stable, that progress only moves forward, that collapse is something that happened to other people in the past? What if that exact feeling has been felt before, multiple times, by people just as confident as we are? Historians and archaeologists sometimes talk about this in an interesting way. They count, not officially, not as some agreed-upon fact you'd find in a textbook, but as a kind of thought experiment. If you look back far enough, you can trace something like 7 major waves of complex civilization rising and falling across human history. Mesopotamia, Egypt's Old Kingdom, the Bronze Age palace societies, Rome, the Maya, Angkor, and so on. Each one thought it was different. Each one thought it was the exception, and each one eventually joined a very long list of places that used to matter enormously, and now show up mostly as ruins, footnotes and warnings. So tonight we're going to ask a strange question. Not where the collapse happened before. That part's settled. We know it did. The real question is this. If those 7 waves came and went, leaving behind broken cities and half-buried temples and silence where there used to be noise, what would an 8th one look like? Not as prophecy, not as fear-mongering, just as an honest, curious look at the pattern our species keeps repeating and where we might currently sit inside it. We're going to walk through deep time together tonight. We'll drift through the earliest human settlements, long before anyone wrote anything down. We'll wander through the first true cities and watch how fragile even the mightiest of them turned out to be. We'll sit with the Akkadians during a drought that changed everything and stand in the darkened halls of Bronze Age palaces after the lights went out across the Mediterranean. We'll trace the slow, complicated unraveling of Rome, the quiet disappearance of Angkor's canals, and the misunderstood story of Rapa Nui. And eventually we'll turn the lens back around toward ourselves, toward the fragile humming machinery of the modern world. The satellites, the server farms, the food systems that depend on thousands of moving parts never breaking at once. Before we go there, though, I want to know something. Where are you right now listening to this? What time is it where you are? I love reading through the comments and realizing this show is being played in so many different places at once. Someone's just waking up in Sydney while someone else is finally closing their eyes in Chicago. It's a strange, quiet kind of connection. All of us drifting off together across different time zones, thinking about the same distant past. If you're enjoying these stories and using them to fall asleep, the best way to support what I'm doing here is genuinely simple. Follow the show on Spotify. Listen there if you can, and if you've got a spare moment, leave a 5-star review. It helps more than you'd think. The link's down in the description if you want to find it easily. All right, let's start at the very beginning, long before cities, long before writing, long before anyone even knew how to keep score of what had been lost. Before we go any further, we should probably slow down and actually define what we're talking about, because the word civilization gets thrown around a lot, and it means something pretty specific when historians and archaeologists use it carefully. A civilization isn't just a lot of people living near each other. Villages have existed for tens of thousands of years without ever becoming what we'd call a civilization. What makes something a civilization is the network. Cities that depend on surrounding farmland to feed them. institutions, kings, priesthoods, bureaucracies, courts that coordinate the behavior of thousands or millions of people who will never meet each other. Knowledge systems, writing, mathematics, engineering, that get passed down and improved across generations instead of being reinvented from scratch every time someone dies. Trade routes that move grain, metal, and ideas across distances that would take months to walk. And shared infrastructure, roads, canals, granaries, temples that only make sense if you assume the whole system is going to keep running for a very long time. That's the definition we're working with tonight. Not a village. Not a kingdom. A civilization is a web of interdependence so large and so complex that most of the people living inside it can't actually see all its moving parts. You eat bread made from wheat grown by a farmer you'll never meet, processed by a mill you've never visited, using tools forged from ore mines somewhere you couldn't point to on a map. That's not a modern phenomenon. That's just what civilization has always meant, all the way back to the first cities of Mesopotamia. Now, here's something worth clarifying before we go further, because it matters. When historians talk about 7 waves of civilization, or when we talk tonight about the possibility of an 8th, that's not a real classification system. There's no official archaeological chart somewhere that numbers them 1 through 7 and leaves a blank space for whatever comes next. You won't find civilization number 4 written in any peer-reviewed journal. This is a metaphor, a way of organizing an incredibly messy, overlapping, and often contradictory historical record into something a human mind can actually hold on to. The truth is far messier than a numbered list. Civilizations rose in different places at wildly different times. Some overlapped with each other for centuries. Some influenced each other directly. Others developed in near total isolation, never knowing the other existed. The idea of counting them in sequence, Mesopotamia, then Egypt, then the Bronze Age palace states, then Rome, then the Maya, then Angkor, is a storytelling device. It's useful because it lets us see a pattern, but it's not a scientific fact in the way that, say, radiocarbon dating is a scientific fact. Keep that distinction in mind as we go tonight. We're using the number 7 and the possibility of an 8th as a lens for thinking, not as an established truth carved into stone. There's another distinction that matters just as much, maybe more. When we say a civilization collapsed, we almost never mean that the people who lived there simply vanished. This is one of the most common misunderstandings about ancient collapse, and it's worth sitting with for a moment because it changes the entire emotional weight of the story. The state can disappear while the people remain. The palace can go dark while the villages around it keep farming the same fields their grandparents farmed. The writing system can be forgotten while the language it once recorded keeps being spoken around cooking fires for another 1,000 years. What collapses, in almost every case we know of, isn't the population. It's the complexity, it's the network, it's the elaborate scaffolding of trade routes, tax systems, standing armies and long-distance administration that made a civilization feel like a single unified thing instead of a scattered collection of communities doing their own thing. Think of it less like a light switch turning off, and more like a massive orchestra slowly losing its musicians one section at a time until what's left isn't silence. It's just a much smaller, quieter performance. The people are still there. They're still playing. But the grand symphony that once required hundreds of coordinated instruments has shrunk down to a handful of local tunes. This distinction matters because it changes how we should think about collapse. It's tempting, especially at night, lying in the dark, imagining the end of something as vast as your own civilization, to picture total annihilation. Cities swallowed by jungle, streets empty forever. Everyone gone, but that's rarely, if ever, what actually happened. What happened, over and over again across thousands of years, was simplification. Fragmentation, a retreat from complexity back towards something smaller and more local. Sometimes that retreat lasted a generation. Sometimes it lasted centuries. Here's something else worth thinking about before we move forward into deep time. Human history feels remarkably continuous when you read it in a book. One sentence flows into the next. Mesopotamia gives way to Babylon. Babylon gives way to Persia. Persia gives way to Alexander. It reads like a relay race, baton passed smoothly from one runner to the next across thousands of years. But that's an illusion created by writing itself. The actual archaeological record looks nothing like that. It looks like layers of ash and abandonment. It looks like cities built directly on top of the collapsed ruins of earlier cities, sometimes centuries after those earlier cities went silent. It looks like gaps, long stretches of time where we have almost no evidence of what was happening to ordinary people, only scattered clues, a broken pot here, a burned layer of soil there, a written record that simply stops mid-sentence and never resumes. Writing gives us the comforting sensation of an unbroken thread. The dirt tells a different story. The dirt tells us that human civilization has never actually been one continuous thing. It's been built, abandoned, rebuilt, abandoned again, forgotten, rediscovered, and reinterpreted more times than we can probably ever fully count. Which brings us finally to the real question sitting underneath everything we're going to explore tonight. When a civilization goes quiet, when the trade routes stop, when the writing systems fall out of use, when the great cities empty out and the jungle or the desert or the grassland slowly reclaims what people built, what actually happened? Was that an ending? Was it a transformation? One form of human organization dissolving so that something new could eventually take its place? Or was it something closer to a reset, a return to a simpler starting point from which an entirely new civilization could someday rise, carrying only fragments of memory from what came before? We're not going to answer that question yet. We're going to spend the rest of tonight gathering evidence, walking slowly through 7 long and complicated stories before we ever try to guess what an 8th might mean for us. And before the first cities, before kings started carving victories into stone, before accountants pressed little wedges into wet clay to record how much barley had entered a temple storehouse, there is a much deeper past. A past without written records. A past where nearly everything we know has to be pulled carefully from the ground. This is where the story gets difficult, and also where it gets interesting, because writing creates an archive. It gives us names, dates, arguments, tax lists, laws, prayers, complaints. It lets a dead person reach across 5,000 years and tell us, in their own words, that a shipment was late, a field was flooded, a king owed them silver. Without writing, we don't get that kind of access. We get objects, stone tools, charred seeds, animal bones, fragments of pottery, post holes where wooden houses once stood, burials, hearths, a strange arrangement of stones on a hilltop. From those fragments, archaeologists reconstruct whole worlds. But reconstruction is not the same thing as certainty. A stone circle can tell us that people gathered labour, moved heavy materials, and cared enough to create something that lasted. It cannot tell us exactly what they said while building it. A grave with beads and tools can suggest ritual, status, affection, or ideas about death. It cannot give us a transcript of the funeral. We are reading a book after most of its pages have dissolved, trying to understand the plot from a few sentences that happen to be written on stone. And there is another problem. The places where people most like to live were often the places least likely to survive. For most of human existence, coastlines were magnets. They offered fish, shellfish, birds, fresh water from rivers, routes for travel, and access to both land and sea. A coastal settlement could draw food from many different environments without travelling very far. If you were a small community living near the end of the last ice age, a sheltered bay or river mouth might have seemed like the best place in the world. But it may now be underwater. At the peak of the last ice age, enormous volumes of water were locked up in continental ice sheets. Sea level was more than 100 meters lower than it is today. The map of the world looked different. The Persian Gulf was largely dry land and river valleys. Britain was connected to continental Europe by a low plain now called Doggerland. Southeast Asia formed a much larger landmass, with islands that are now separated by deep blue water joined together by exposed shelves. Coastlines stretched far beyond their modern boundaries. Then the ice melted, not in one single cinematic flood, not as a single global tsunami washing away every settlement at once, but over thousands of years, with periods of faster rise and slower rise. Shorelines moved inland, river valleys drowned, low plains became seabeds. Any camps, villages, fish traps, graves, workshops and gathering places built along those old coasts were gradually covered by water, sand, mud and marine sediment. This means the archaeological map is biased. We tend to find what survived on dry land. And dry land is not necessarily where the most people lived. There are glimpses of this lost coastal world. Divers have found submerged stone structures, ancient landscapes, and traces of human activity beneath parts of the North Sea, the Mediterranean, and the waters around Southeast Asia. Off the coast of Israel, at a site called Atlit Yam, archaeologists have found a submerged Neolithic village with stone-built structures, wells, and burials. It is a reminder that the sea floor is not empty history. It is a flooded archive, but flooded archives are hard to read. Excavating on land is difficult enough. Excavating beneath waves, currents, and layers of sediment is another level entirely. Much of the ancient coastline remains unexplored, not because there is nothing there, but because looking for it is expensive, technically demanding, and slow. So when people ask whether there could have been complex human societies before the first known cities, the careful answer is yes, of course there could have been. There were certainly societies we have not found. There were settlements now underwater. There were wooden buildings that rotted away. There were camps on floodplains buried beneath meters of silt. There were entire generations whose footprints disappeared almost as soon as they were made. But that possibility has limits. Missing evidence is not positive evidence for any particular story. This is where some of the most impressive prehistoric sites can pull the imagination in two directions at once. Take Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. It was built more than 11,000 years ago before pottery, before metalworking, and before fully developed agriculture in that region. On a hilltop, people erected enormous T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing many tons. They carved animals on them: foxes, snakes, wild boar, birds, insects. The pillars stood in circular enclosures, arranged with a level of planning and labour coordination that feels startling when you remember how early they are. For a long time, the standard story went something like this. First people became farmers, then villages grew larger, then surplus food supported specialists, priests, monuments, and eventually cities. Göbekli Tepe complicated that neat sequence. Here were monumental structures built by people who appear to have still depended heavily on hunting and gathering. It suggested that collective ritual, feasting, social competition, or shared belief may have helped bring people together before agriculture was fully established, rather than simply appearing after farming had done all the work. In other words, maybe people did not settle down and become organized because farming made temples possible. Maybe gathering to build temples, hold ceremonies, and feed large crowds helped create the pressures that made farming more attractive. That is a profound idea. Not because it proves some vanished super-civilization, but because it reminds us that prehistoric people were not primitive in the way that word is often casually used. They were capable of planning, cooperation, symbolic thought, long-distance connections, skilled craftsmanship. They had social worlds rich enough to persuade hundreds of people to do difficult work for reasons we can only partly understand. Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Nearby sites such as Karahan Tepe reveal related monumental traditions. In the Jordan Valley, communities at places like Jericho were building substantial settlements and ritual structures very early in the Holocene. In Anatolia, Çatalhöyük would later grow into a dense settlement of mud brick houses, its residents living roof to roof in a community that lasted for centuries. In Japan, Jomon communities made pottery long before agriculture became central to their economy. In many parts of the world, people created complex social systems without cities, states, writing, or kings. Complexity came first in many forms. Civilization, in the narrower sense we defined earlier, came later. And that distinction matters. A monument is not a city. A city is not an empire. An impressive stone structure does not automatically imply global trade networks, advanced machines, lost writing systems, or a forgotten worldwide civilization destroyed by catastrophe. Humans have always been capable of doing remarkable things with stone, wood, fibre, patience, and coordinated labour. You do not need a hidden industrial age to explain a monumental site. You need people with time, skill, leadership, social bonds, and a powerful reason to work together. Sometimes that reason may have been religious, sometimes political, sometimes practical, sometimes all three, mixed together so completely that separating them would make no sense to the people who built the place. The real mystery is not that ancient people could build impressive things. We know they could. The real mystery is how much of their world has vanished without leaving a clear trace. Some evidence is under the sea, some is beneath river sediment, where changing channels have buried old landscapes. Some lies under forests that grew after fields were abandoned. Some is buried beneath modern cities where every new apartment block sits on top of layers of older human life. And some is simply gone. Wood burns, cloth rots, houses made from earth slump back into earth. Oral histories can survive for astonishing lengths of time, but they change, branch, and fade. The deeper we go into the past, the more silence surrounds the evidence. That silence is not permission to invent whatever we want. But it should make us humble. We do not possess the whole human story. We possess the parts that survived accidents of geology, climate, preservation, and discovery. The history we tell is built from what endured, not necessarily from what mattered most to the people who lived it. And as we move toward the first true cities, that is worth remembering. Civilization did not appear out of an empty world. It rose from thousands of years of experiments in cooperation, settlement, ritual, trade, food production, and memory. Long before anyone wrote a king's name on a tablet, human beings were already testing the fragile idea that large numbers of strangers could build something together, maintain it, and pass it on. Soon, in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, that experiment would become larger, denser, and far more interconnected than ever before. And with it would come the first cities, the first states, the first written records, and the first clear evidence of just how fragile a complex human system could be. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in the land the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the experiment became something new. This was not a gentle landscape. Southern Mesopotamia had rich soil, but little reliable rainfall. It was flat, hot, and exposed. The rivers could bring life in the form of water and fertile silt. They could also bring disaster in the form of floods that arrived at the wrong time, broke through embankments, drowned fields, and shifted their channels without asking anyone's permission. To live there in large numbers, people had to manage the water. That meant canals, ditches, levees, gates, reservoirs, teams of workers clearing mud and weeds from channels before they became blocked. It meant deciding who got water first when there was not enough. It meant convincing thousands of people to do repetitive, exhausting work because a canal was not useful to one household alone. It only worked if the whole system worked, and once it worked, it could produce abundance on a scale earlier villages had rarely known. By the 4th millennium BCE, settlements in southern Mesopotamia were growing into cities. Uruk, perhaps the most famous, may at its height have held tens of thousands of people. That was extraordinary for its time. Imagine it. Not a village where everyone recognizes every face, knows every family dispute, and can walk to the fields in a few minutes. A real city, dense neighborhoods of mud brick houses, workshops, temples, markets, boats moving along canals, herds being brought through gates, laborers hauling reeds, clay, timber, and grain. There were strangers everywhere, and strangers require systems. The foundation of those systems was grain, barley especially. It could be grown in irrigated fields, harvested in large quantities, dried, stored, measured, redistributed, taxed, traded, and used to feed workers who were not farmers. Grain is not just food. In the ancient world, grain was energy made portable. It was wages, it was insurance against a bad season. It was political power sitting inside a warehouse. If a temple or palace controlled the storehouses, it could support builders, boatmen, potters, weavers, soldiers, scribes, priests, and officials. A farmer did not need to make every tool, weave every cloth, build every house, or organize every defense. Specialists could do those things instead. This was one of the great advantages of urban life. When food production became reliable enough, some people could spend their days doing other work. A metal worker could become very good at metalworking. A potter could make hundreds of vessels. A merchant could learn distant routes. A builder could coordinate large construction projects. A priest could oversee ceremonies that brought a community together. A ruler could command labor and wage war, and an accountant could count. At first, the counting may have been done with clay tokens, little shaped objects representing animals, measures of grain, jars of oil, and other goods. Later, people began pressing marks into wet clay tablets. Over time, these marks became writing. The earliest writing in Mesopotamia was not poetry. It was not philosophy, it was administration. How much barley entered the storehouse? How many sheep were assigned to a temple? Which worker received rations? Who owed what? Which field produced less than expected? Civilization, at least in one of its first written forms, began with someone needing a better way to keep track of stuff. There is something almost comforting about that. The first cities were already full of very human problems. Missing deliveries, disputed accounts, workers needing food, officials trying to make complicated systems run on time. But writing changed more than bookkeeping. Once information could be fixed in clay, it could outlive the person who first spoke it. Orders could travel farther, taxes could be recorded, land grants could be remembered, labour could be organised across seasons. Institutions could become larger than any individual memory. A temple could preserve its accounts year after year. A city could coordinate people who had never met each other. This was a new kind of power, and it made cities possible at a scale no small farming village could sustain. But it also made cities dependent. That is the pattern to watch closely, because it appears again and again in the history of civilization. The very systems that create abundance can make a society less flexible when conditions change. A small village might survive a poor harvest by moving, gathering more wild food, relying on kin in another settlement, or simply reducing its needs. A city cannot easily do that. A city has walls, storehouses, temples, workshops, officials, and thousands of mouths to feed. It cannot pick itself up and walk away from a failing river. Its farmers may live outside its walls, but its survival depends on them every day. And irrigated agriculture had a hidden problem. Mesopotamian farmers were bringing river water onto dry fields under an intensely hot sun. Water evaporated. The minerals dissolved in it remained behind. Season after season, those salts could build up in the soil. This process is called salinization. It still affects irrigated agriculture in many parts of the world today. The ancient evidence suggests that salinity became a serious long-term problem in parts of southern Mesopotamia. Farmers increasingly relied on barley, which tolerates salt better than wheat. Some fields likely became less productive. Yields may have fallen in certain areas over long periods. Not everywhere, not all at once, and not for one simple reason. Rivers shifted. Political boundaries changed. War interrupted maintenance. Climate varied. Local farmers adapted in clever ways. But the underlying problem remained. A system designed to pull abundance from a difficult environment was gradually changing that environment. Think about the strange trap this created. The more people a city supported, the more fields it needed. The more fields it irrigated, the more canals it had to maintain. The more canals it maintained, the more labour and political coordination were required. And if the soil began losing fertility, the city needed even more land, more water, more workers, more control. Success could create obligations that only further success could pay for. Then there was conflict. Mesopotamia was not one unified country in its early urban period. It was a patchwork of city-states. Uruk, Lagash, Kish, Nippur, each with its own rulers, temples, lands, canals, alliances, rivalries and ambitions. Their boundaries were often not mountains or forests. They were fields, watercourses and irrigation channels, which meant disputes over territory were also disputes over water. A canal could nourish a city. It could also become a weapon. If an upstream community diverted water, damaged a channel, or seized contested farmland, the effects could spread far beyond one village. A conflict between rulers might mean hunger for families who had never heard the ruler's name. Armies could burn crops, destroy canals, carry away livestock, and interrupt the yearly routines needed to keep an agricultural system alive. And unlike a stone wall, a canal does not remain useful when abandoned. It silts up. Its banks collapse. Reeds take over. Water finds another path. This is one reason early states were always doing maintenance. Building was impressive. Maintenance was survival. A king could gain glory by raising a temple platform or defeating an enemy. But someone still had to organize the workers who cleared the canal next spring. Someone had to measure grain correctly. Someone had to repair the gate before flood season. Someone had to make sure the storehouses were guarded, the oxen were healthy, and the labourers received enough rations to keep working. Civilization was never just monuments. It was maintenance repeated forever, and there were environmental pressures beyond salinity. Mesopotamian rainfall could fluctuate. Droughts could reduce river flow and shrink harvests. Floods could destroy a season's work. Dust storms and heat could make already difficult years worse. Archaeologists and climate researchers can identify broad periods of stress in some regions, but connecting a particular drought directly to a particular political event is often difficult. The evidence rarely gives us a clean answer. Still, the general picture is clear enough. These early cities lived close to the edge of what their environment could support. They were productive because people managed land and water with extraordinary skill. They were vulnerable for exactly the same reason. The system had to keep working. And when it did work, it produced things no earlier human society had created at this scale. Cities, states, written archives, long-distance trade, social classes, formal law, organized armies, monumental temples, kings who claimed authority over thousands of lives. It also produced inequality. Some people lived in large houses and controlled land, labour, and stored wealth. Others worked in fields, workshops, kitchens, and building gangs. Some were free labourers. Some were dependent workers. Some were enslaved. The city concentrated opportunity, but it also concentrated power. That concentration made civilization stronger in some ways. A city-state could mobilize resources quickly. It could build walls, feed armies, dig canals, and respond to emergencies with a level of coordination a scattered farming community could not match. But it meant that failure could spread quickly too. A bad harvest was no longer just a bad harvest for one family. It could become a shortage in the storehouses, a crisis in wages, unrest among workers, weakened defences, political blame and conflict with neighbours. If a ruler lost control of irrigation, grain or trade, the entire structure above those things could begin to shake. The first cities were not fragile because their people were foolish. They were fragile because complexity always has a cost. Every solution creates new dependencies. Every layer of organisation solves one problem while introducing another. The canal brings water, but requires maintenance. The storehouse prevents famine, but creates a target for theft and conquest. Writing preserves knowledge, but can also make administration more rigid. A powerful ruler can coordinate a response, but can also make one bad decision matter to millions. This was the ancient bargain. People accepted dependence on systems because those systems made possible a life of abundance, safety, culture, and connection that had never existed before. For long stretches of time the bargain worked. Mesopotamian cities endured, adapted, fought, traded, merged, divided, and rose again. But the warning signs were already there. The land was changing. The rivers were unpredictable. The cities were competing. The fields needed constant care, and the more elaborate the system became, the harder it was to change direction when the old methods stopped working. Soon one ruler would try to bind much of this fractured world into something even larger, the Akkadian Empire. And when drought, war, political strain, and environmental pressure converged, it would offer one of history's first clear warnings that even a powerful civilization can discover too late how narrow its foundations really were. The empire began with a man named Sargon. We do not know exactly how much of the later story about him is true. Ancient kings collected legends the way modern nations collect monuments. But sometime around the 24th century BCE, Sargon of Akkad did something extraordinary. He conquered city after city across Mesopotamia and created what is often called one of the world's first territorial empires. Earlier rulers had controlled cities and nearby farmland. Sargon claimed something larger. His authority reached across southern Mesopotamia, north into the rain-fed plains of what is now Syria and Iraq, east toward Elam, and perhaps along trade routes reaching Anatolia and the Persian Gulf. For the first time, at least on this scale, one political system tried to bind many different landscapes, languages, cities and peoples into a single structure. Its capital was Akkad, or Agaday, a city so important in ancient memory that its name survived for thousands of years. And yet its physical location is still uncertain. Archaeologists have not found it. One of the great capitals of the ancient world may still lie buried somewhere beneath the Mesopotamian plain, hidden by shifting rivers, later settlement, or simple bad luck. But the empire itself left traces everywhere. Its kings placed governors in conquered cities. They demanded tribute. They moved troops. They controlled roads and river routes. They drew wealth from distant provinces in the form of grain, livestock, timber, metals, stone and labour. Royal inscriptions describe victories in grand, almost breathless language. Sargon's successors claimed dominion over the four quarters of the world. That phrase did not mean they literally ruled the entire planet. It meant something more revealing. They believed they had pushed political power to the edge of the imaginable world. And for a while the system worked. The Akkadian Empire depended on the same ancient equation that had made the first cities possible. Agricultural surplus fed administrators and soldiers. Taxes funded armies. Armies conquered new territory. New territory brought more resources into the centre. Those resources supported more officials, more building, more warfare, more ambition. It was a machine powered by grain. Southern Mesopotamia, with its irrigated barley fields, remained a crucial source of food. Northern regions, where rainfall was usually more dependable, could also produce large harvests without the same intensity of canal irrigation. Distant lands supplied things Mesopotamia lacked. Wood from mountain regions, silver and copper from faraway mines, stone for statues and buildings, precious materials for temples and palaces. The empire connected all of it, but connecting regions also meant connecting their risks. A local crop failure could be managed, a city revolt could be crushed. A border raid could be answered with soldiers, but when several pressures arrived at once across a large area, the same networks that carried wealth could carry crisis. That is what seems to have happened near the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. Around 4,200 years ago, climate records from several parts of the Near East suggest a period of increased aridity. In plain language, some regions became drier, rainfall patterns shifted. Growing seasons may have become less reliable. Dust and drought appear in environmental records from the region, though the details differ from place to place. At sites in northern Mesopotamia and Syria, archaeologists have found signs that some settlements were abandoned or sharply reduced around this time. One famous site, Tel Leilan in northeastern Syria, contains a layer associated with wind-blown dust and a break in occupation. Fields that had supported dense populations may have become harder to farm. Communities that relied on regular rain faced a terrible problem. You can dig a canal if a river is nearby. You cannot easily command rain to fall over a dry plain. Think about what drought means in an empire built on surplus. It does not just mean less food, it means fewer rations for workers, fewer supplies for garrisons, less grain collected as tax, higher prices in markets, more pressure on families already close to the edge, people leaving villages in search of water, work or safety, officials being asked to deliver what the land can no longer provide. And every ruler faces the same impossible choice. Do you reduce demands and risk weakening the army? Do you keep taxes high and risk revolt? Do you send grain to a hungry province and leave the capital exposed? Do you punish local leaders for failures they may not be able to prevent? The Akkadian kings had faced rebellion before. Nearly every early empire did. Conquest creates enemies, and distant provinces do not always enjoy sending their harvests and young men to a ruler far away. Naram Sin, one of Akkad's most powerful kings, spent much of his reign fighting revolts. His inscriptions celebrate victory after victory, which is often a clue that there were many people to defeat. He eventually took the astonishing title, God of Akkad, presenting himself not merely as king, but as divine. It was an immense claim, but even divine kings depend on roads, grain, loyal officials and soldiers who are fed. By the time of Naram Sin's successors, the empire was under strain. There were internal conflicts. there were rebellions. There were attacks and migrations involving groups later remembered as Gutians from the Zagros Mountains. There were local political struggles that had nothing to do with climate, and there may have been failures in the administrative system itself. An empire spread across huge distances is difficult to govern in good years. In bad years, messages arrive late, commanders act on incomplete information, and provincial elites begin calculating whether loyalty is still worth the cost. This is where the story becomes complicated. For a long time, people wanted a single explanation for Akkad's fall. Drought did it, invaders did it, rebellion did it, bad rulers did it, but ancient collapse is rarely that neat. The evidence for a period of climatic stress is serious. Many researchers connect the late 3rd millennium BCE drought to disruption across northern Mesopotamia and Syria. Yet the exact timing, severity, and geographic reach remain debated. Not every place declined in the same way. Some southern cities continued. Some communities adapted. Political systems can weaken before a drought arrives, and drought can become catastrophic, mainly because a society is already divided, overextended, or unable to respond. Climate may not have destroyed the Akkadian Empire by itself, but it may have made every other problem harder to solve. A drought is not just an environmental event, it is a test of institutions. It asks whether grain can move where it is needed, whether rulers can adjust demands, whether communities trust one another enough to share losses, whether people can preserve the maintenance systems that keep fields, canals, roads, and storehouses functioning. The Akkadian Empire failed that test, or perhaps it faced more tests than any system of its time could have passed. By around 2150 BCE, its political unity had broken apart. The great imperial centre no longer commanded the four quarters of the world. Cities and regions reasserted themselves. New rulers rose. Old networks changed. Mesopotamia did not become empty. People did not forget farming, writing, trade, or city life. Civilization did not vanish, but one particular order vanished, and later Mesopotamians remembered that loss. They turned it into a story called the Curse of Agade. In it, the empire's disaster was not explained through rainfall records, administrative failure, or the pressures of governing distant provinces. It was explained as a moral and cosmic catastrophe. The king had offended the gods. Divine favour was withdrawn. The land suffered, order dissolved. This is what collapse often becomes in memory. Not a tangled chain of drought. Politics, logistics, conflict, and human decisions. A simpler story, a warning, a lost golden age followed by punishment. The Akkadian Empire had shown that people could build power across immense distances. Its fall showed that scale did not remove vulnerability. It could magnify it, and this lesson would not stay in Mesopotamia. In the centuries ahead, kingdoms around the eastern Mediterranean would become even richer, more connected and more dependent on trade, harvests, armies, and fragile political alliances. Then, in another age of drought, war, migration, and failing systems, much of the Bronze Age world would go dark. For almost 1,000 years after Akkad, the eastern Mediterranean became more connected than any earlier world had ever been. Not united under one emperor. This was not a single empire with one capital and one army. It was something more complicated, and in some ways more fragile. A network of kingdoms. Egypt along the Nile, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, Mycenaean palace states in Greece, merchant cities along the Levantine coast, Cyprus, rich in copper, kingdoms in Syria, Canaan, and Mesopotamia, all linked by ships, caravans, marriages, letters, gifts, debts, treaties, and war. It was the late Bronze Age, roughly 1500 to 1200 BCE, and bronze was the foundation beneath almost everything. Bronze is an alloy, made mostly from copper mixed with tin. Copper could be found in several places around the Mediterranean, especially Cyprus. Tin was much rarer. It came through long and often uncertain trade routes, perhaps from Anatolia, Central Asia, Iran, and even as far away as Western Europe. A king who wanted swords, spearheads, tools, armour, chariot fittings, and prestige objects needed access to both metals. That meant no kingdom was fully self-sufficient. Egypt had grain, gold, and the wealth of the Nile. Cyprus had copper. The forests of Lebanon provided prized cedar timber. Anatolia had silver and other metals. The Aegean world produced pottery, olive oil, wine, textiles, and finely worked goods. Grain moved by ship when harvests failed. Luxury items moved constantly: ivory, glass, perfume, horses, lapis lazuli, carved furniture, gold cups, dyed cloth. At the centre of this world were palaces. A Mycenaean palace at Pylos or Mycenae was not just a royal home. It was an administrative machine. Scribes recorded sheep, grain, perfume, textiles, bronze, weapons, workers and taxes on clay tablets. The palace collected goods from the countryside, stored them, redistributed them, and organised labour. It could equip warriors, sponsor religious ceremonies, and send diplomatic gifts across the sea. The Hittite kings did something similar on a larger scale. From their capital at Hattusa, they managed a vast and often difficult empire of subject lands, client rulers, forts, roads, and grain supplies. Egypt, meanwhile, corresponded with foreign kings as equals. Pharaohs sent letters to Babylonian rulers, Hittite kings, and Levantine princes. They complained about delayed gifts. They negotiated marriages. They asked for gold, horses, and military support. The letters can sound surprisingly familiar. One king writes that another has not sent enough gold. Another asks why his brother, meaning a fellow great king, has ignored him. A ruler requests a princess in marriage because royal marriages were not really about romance. They were alliances written into families. This was international politics, Bronze Age style, and it depended on constant movement. A shipwreck found off the coast of Turkey at Uluburun gives us a glimpse of what one trading vessel could carry around 1300 BCE. Its cargo included copper ingots from Cyprus, tin ingots, glass, ivory, ebony, Canaanite jars, gold jewellery, weapons, tools and goods from several different regions. One ship, one floating piece of a vast economic web. But webs have a problem. They are strong when many strands hold. They can also transmit damage from one place to another. Around 1200 BCE, that great Bronze Age system began to fail. Not everywhere at once. Not for exactly the same reason. Not in a single dramatic night when the whole civilized world burst into flames. But over a relatively short period, perhaps several decades, palaces were destroyed, cities were abandoned, trade routes broke down, and powerful kingdoms disappeared. The Mycenaean palace at Pylos burned. So did other major centres in Greece. The palace archives, written on clay tablets, survived only because the fires accidentally baked them hard enough to endure for thousands of years. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was abandoned and burned. Ugarit, a wealthy port city on the Syrian coast, was destroyed. Its last letters seem to capture a world in panic. One official wrote that enemy ships had arrived. Another reported that the kingdom's forces were away, perhaps fighting elsewhere. Help was needed. Help may never have come. By the early 12th century BCE, the Hittite Empire was gone. The Mycenaean palace system was gone. Many Levantine cities had been destroyed or transformed. Egypt survived, but only after facing severe military pressure and losing much of its influence abroad. For centuries, people searched for one villain. The most famous answer was the Sea Peoples, groups mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions from the reigns of Merneptah and Ramesses III. Egyptian texts describe foreign attackers arriving by land and sea. Some appear to have come with families and carts, not simply as raiders, but as migrating populations. Ramesses III claimed great victories against them. But the Sea Peoples were probably not a single nation, and they are unlikely to explain everything. They may have been part of the collapse. Desperate migrants, opportunistic raiders, displaced soldiers, or coalitions formed from societies already under stress. But asking whether they caused the Bronze Age collapse can be a little like asking whether sparks caused a forest fire. The answer may be yes, but only because the forest was already dry. There were earthquakes. Parts of the eastern Mediterranean lie along active fault zones, and some ruined cities show damage consistent with seismic events. There were wars between kingdoms. There were local rebellions against palace elites. There may have been droughts and harvest failures. Climate evidence suggests that parts of the region experienced drier conditions near the end of the Bronze Age, though the exact pattern varied from place to place. And then there was trade. A palace system needs bronze. Bronze needs tin. Armies need food. Cities need grain. Merchants need safe routes. Kings need allies who can still send ships, soldiers, and gifts. If drought reduces harvests, rulers demand more from farmers. If farmers flee or rebel, palaces lose revenue. If war interrupts sea routes, metal supplies fall. If metal supplies fall, armies weaken. If armies weaken, raids become harder to stop. Then trade becomes even less safe. Every problem makes the next problem worse. That is the real terror of systemic collapse. No single failure has to be fatal, but several manageable failures can lock together until the system cannot recover. The Bronze Age world had become extraordinarily advanced. It had writing, diplomacy, specialized labor, long-distance commerce, military alliances, monumental architecture, and bureaucracies capable of tracking thousands of jars of oil or bushels of grain. It also had dependencies everywhere. When the palaces fell, people did not disappear. Farmers still planted crops. Fishers still worked the coasts. Potters still shaped clay. Small communities endured, but the great international order, the world of kings calling one another brother across the sea, had shattered. And in the darkness after the palaces, survival became local again. But local did not mean lifeless. For the people who lived through the collapse, the end of the palace world was probably not experienced as the end of history. It was more immediate than that. A harvest had to be gathered. A roof had to be repaired. Children had to be fed. A neighbour might arrive with news that the old road was unsafe, that a coastal town had burned, that soldiers or hungry migrants were moving through the valley. The palaces had vanished from their lives, but life continued around their ruins. This is one of the most important things to understand about a so-called Dark Age. Darkness does not mean nobody was there. It means that the kinds of records historians depend on become rare. Fewer inscriptions, fewer archives, fewer large monuments. Less imported luxury goods, a quieter archaeological trace. The people remain. The paperwork disappears. In Greece, the great Mycenaean centres were no longer directing the countryside. The scribes who had written Linear B tablets were gone, or at least their administrative system was gone. Writing itself seems to have disappeared from much of the Aegean for several centuries. Not because every person forgot that marks could represent words, but because the institution that needed thousands of records, the palace, no longer existed. No palace meant no central warehouse, no central tax system. No need to track every sheep, every bronze tool, every jar of scented oil. And without the palace workshops, many specialized crafts became harder to maintain. A master ivory carver needs ivory, a bronze smith needs copper, tin, fuel, tools, and customers wealthy enough to pay for fine work. A scribe needs training clay and an administration that values written records. When long-distance trade failed and elite demand shrank, these professions did not necessarily vanish overnight, but they became rarer. Knowledge that depended on a chain of teachers, materials, and institutions could be lost surprisingly fast. Imagine being the only person in a small village who knows how to make a certain kind of bronze fitting. Then imagine the tin no longer arrives. Your skill still exists, but it has nowhere to go. This is what simplification looks like. Settlements became smaller. In some regions, people moved away from exposed coastal plains and into hilltops, inland valleys or places easier to defend. Some old cities survived in reduced form. Others were abandoned. New communities appeared where water, pasture, and safety could be found. Population probably fell in many areas, though not in every place, and not for a single reason. Some people died in violence or famine, some left. Some joined migrating groups. Some simply reorganized their lives around smaller, more self-sufficient communities. The Mediterranean had not become empty. It had become less connected. That difference matters. A farmer in a village might have had less access to imported metals, luxury pottery, and royal protection. But they may also have been less exposed to the demands of a distant palace. No official arriving to collect grain for a king's storeroom. No labour draft for a monumental building project. No bureaucracy measuring every flock. Collapse is not equally terrible for everyone. The loss of a palace is catastrophic for a palace official. For a farmer, it can mean danger, uncertainty, and poverty. But it can also mean that power has moved farther away. Over time, people adjusted. They rebuilt houses with local materials. They used iron more often, not because iron was magically superior in every way, but because its ores were more widely available than tin. Iron working required difficult skills and high temperatures, yet it did not depend on the same fragile international supply chain that bronze did. A village with access to local ore and a skilled smith had options that a Bronze Age palace system might not have valued. Trade returned too, though at first on a smaller scale. Sailors still knew the sea. Families still remembered old routes. Coastal communities continued exchanging goods, stories, marriage partners and techniques. In the Levant, cities such as Tyre, Sidon and Byblos endured or recovered. Their merchants would eventually establish trading settlements across the Mediterranean, carrying timber, purple dye, metalwork, and a writing system with enormous consequences. The alphabet. Earlier writing systems had often required years of specialized training. Cuneiform used hundreds of signs. Egyptian hieroglyphs were complex and flexible, but also demanding. The alphabet used a much smaller set of symbols, mostly representing sounds. It was not invented from nothing after the collapse. Alphabetic scripts had existed earlier in the region. But in the centuries after the Bronze Age, Phoenician traders helped spread one version widely. And when Greeks adopted and adapted it, adding symbols for vowels, writing returned to the Aegean in a new form. Not as palace accounting, as something more portable. A merchant could use it, a craftsman could use it. A community could mark a dedication, a boundary, a name. Eventually, poets and lawmakers could use it too. Writing had survived the collapse by changing its job. Political life changed in the same way. The huge kingdoms of the late Bronze Age did not simply reappear. In Anatolia and northern Syria, smaller Neo-Hittite and Aramaean states emerged from the wreckage of the Hittite world. Along the Levantine coast, Phoenician city-states became powerful centres of trade. In the highlands of Canaan, new village societies developed, among them the communities that would eventually form the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. In Greece, authority became more local. A powerful household, a war leader, a council of elders, a religious centre, a fortified hilltop. These were not yet the famous city-states of classical Greece. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and the rest were still far in the future. But the foundations were forming slowly, almost invisibly, in communities learning how to govern without a palace. And perhaps they remembered the old world. This is difficult to prove. Oral tradition leaves no clay tablets, but stories can preserve fragments for a very long time, changing each time they are told. The Greek epics written down centuries later describe great kings, walled cities, sea voyages, bronze weapons, feasts, raids, and a war at Troy. They are not straightforward historical records. Homer was not a reporter standing outside Mycenae with a notebook, but the poems may contain distant echoes of a world that had already become legendary, a world of chiefs and ships, heroic gifts and burning cities, remembered through generations of singers. That is another way civilizations survive. Not in buildings, not in archives. In stories a grand capital can fall, its writing vanish, its trade routes break, and yet people may carry pieces of it onward in songs, rituals, place names, family memories, and old rules whose original purpose nobody fully remembers. The Bronze Age collapse was not a reset to zero. It was a reset to smaller scales. The great machine broke apart, but its people adapted. New tools, new routes, new identities, new political forms. Centuries later, the eastern Mediterranean would again become crowded with cities, ships, armies, writing, and ambition. But the next civilizations would not be copies of the old ones. They would be built from the fragments, and far across the Atlantic, in another world of cities, calendars, kings, and complicated dependencies. A different civilization would show how collapse can happen without one final night, one final invasion, or one final moment when everything goes dark. The Maya built one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the ancient Americas. Not one unified empire ruled from a single capital, but a crowded landscape of rival city-states. Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, Caracol, Dos Pilas, each with its own dynasty, its own sacred places, its own alliances, enemies and ambitions. Across the forests of what are now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, Maya rulers raised stone pyramids above the trees. They built plazas wide enough for thousands of people. They carved the names of kings onto monuments. They developed a complex writing system, one of the most fully understood scripts in the ancient Americas. They kept track of time with interlocking calendars of extraordinary precision. They watched the movements of Venus. They calculated eclipses. They recorded births, wars, marriages, captures, defeats, and anniversaries that stretched backward into mythic time. To look at a classic Maya city at its height, somewhere around the 7th or 8th century, would have been to see a world that seemed permanent. Temple roofs rose high above the jungle canopy. White plaster caught the sun. Priests conducted rituals. Scribes painted books made from bark paper. Farmers worked maize fields, orchards, wetlands, and terraces beyond the city centre. Messengers moved along raised roads between settlements. Noble families competed to sponsor monuments, feasts, wars, and building projects. And then, in many of the great cities of the southern lowlands, the inscriptions began to stop. Not all at once, not everywhere, not on one terrible morning when every temple fell silent. This is the first thing to understand about the so-called Maya collapse. There was no single final day. Between roughly the late 8th century and the 10th century, many major centres in the southern lowlands experienced deep decline. Kings stopped raising dated monuments, royal courts weakened or disappeared. Large construction projects ended, populations fell in some regions. Palaces were abandoned. Forests slowly pressed inward around plazas that had once been swept clean by labourers every day. At places like Dos Pilas and Agueteca, warfare seems to have played an important role. Defensive walls appeared. Fortified refuges were occupied. In some cases, archaeologists have found evidence of hurried departures, objects left behind in ways that suggest people did not simply pack carefully and move on at their leisure. Maya inscriptions themselves tell part of the story. They describe conflicts between dynasties, captured rulers, defeated cities, broken alliances. The classic Maya world was never peaceful. Warfare had always been part of political life. But in the final centuries, conflict may have become more frequent, more destructive, and harder for weakened states to absorb. Imagine a system of competing city-states where each king needs victories to prove his legitimacy. A ruler who loses a war may lose tribute, allies, and prestige. A city that cannot protect its farmers may lose population. A dynasty unable to perform the rituals expected of it may be seen as failing, not just politically but cosmically. Then add drought. The southern Maya lowlands had no great river like the Nile flowing reliably through the heart of the region. Many cities depended heavily on seasonal rainfall, stored in reservoirs, wetlands, and natural depressions. In good years, this system could support large populations. In bad years, water became a source of pressure almost immediately. Climate records from lake sediments and cave formations suggest that the region experienced episodes of severe drought during the period of decline. The exact timing and intensity varied from place to place, and drought alone cannot explain everything. But repeated dry years would have been devastating in a densely populated landscape already shaped by rivalry, warfare, and heavy demands on farmers. Less rain means smaller harvests. Smaller harvests mean hunger, debt, migration, and political anger. Reservoirs run low, forest gardens fail. A ruler who claims to communicate with the gods now has to explain why the rains have not come. And drought may have been worsened by the Maya success itself. Large populations required fields, fuelwood, lime plaster, and building materials. In some areas, deforestation, soil erosion, and pressure on local ecosystems may have made communities more vulnerable when the climate turned dry. This does not mean the Maya foolishly destroyed their own world. Maya farmers used sophisticated methods, including terracing, irrigation, raised fields, and carefully managed forest resources. But even a well-managed system can be pushed beyond its limits when population, politics, and climate all begin pulling in the same direction. Trade disruptions mattered too. The Maya city-states were connected by networks carrying obsidian, jade, salt, cacao, feathers, pottery, shell, and other valuable goods. These were not luxuries alone. Trade helped support alliances, royal status, craft production, and the political economy of the cities. When routes became dangerous, when ports shifted, when rival states blocked movement, the effects could spread far beyond the battlefield. This is what collapse often looks like in real life. Not one cause. A drought weakens harvests. Food shortages create unrest. Unrest makes warfare more likely. Warfare interrupts trade. Trade failures weaken rulers. Weak rulers cannot organize reservoirs, defenses, or relief. People begin leaving, and every departure makes it harder to maintain the city that remains. But the Maya did not disappear. They did not vanish into the jungle like a lost civilization swallowed whole by vines. Millions of Maya people lived through the changes. Communities moved toward regions with more reliable water, different trade opportunities, or stronger local governments. Some cities in the northern Yucatan continued to flourish. Chichen Itza rose after many southern lowland centers had declined. Later, Mayapan became another powerful center. In the highlands of Guatemala, Maya kingdoms continued, adapted, fought, traded, and preserved their own traditions. When Spanish invaders arrived centuries later, they did not encounter an empty land. They encountered Maya peoples, speaking Maya languages, living in towns and villages, practicing agriculture, maintaining political traditions, and resisting conquest for generations. And they are still here. Today, millions of Maya people live across Mexico and Central America. They speak dozens of related languages. They maintain textiles, ceremonies, foods, farming knowledge, family histories, and community identities rooted in a past far deeper than any ruined pyramid. The classic Maya collapse was real. Cities declined. Dynasties ended. Knowledge was lost, including most of the bark paper books destroyed later during the colonial period. But the people survived by doing what people so often do when a great system breaks apart. They moved, they adapted, they carried what they could. A civilization can lose its capitals without losing its descendants. And that is an important correction to the fantasy of the final day. Sometimes the ruins are not the grave of a people. They are evidence of a change in where power lived, how life was organized, and what kind of future remained possible. The Maya world did not end. It changed shape. And on the other side of the Atlantic, another civilization would reveal an even slower version of the same process. Not a sudden fall from a mountaintop, but centuries of strain, division, adaptation, and gradual unraveling. Rome. Rome is probably the most famous collapse in history. Ask someone when the Roman Empire fell, and they may give you a date almost immediately. 476 CE. The year a Germanic military leader named Odoacer removed the last Western emperor, a young man with the almost absurdly Roman name Romulus Augustulus. The imperial crown was sent east to Constantinople. The Western court was gone, and that was that. Or at least that is how the story is often told. One moment marble forums, legions, aqueducts, emperors, roads stretching across continents. The next, barbarians at the gates, Rome in ruins, darkness descending over Europe. But real history is usually quieter than its legend. The Roman world did not fall like a statue knocked from a pedestal. It unravelled like an enormous fabric, thread by thread across centuries. Some parts tore, some were stitched back together. Some changed colour so gradually that people living through it may not have felt they were witnessing the end of anything at all. At its greatest extent, in the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire controlled lands from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. Tens of millions of people lived under Roman rule. Grain moved from North Africa and Egypt to feed cities. Taxes flowed toward imperial treasuries. Armies guarded frontiers along the Rhine, the Danube, and the deserts of the east. Roman law, Roman coins, Roman roads, Roman citizenship all bound an immense and varied world into something that seemed durable. But size creates strength only up to a point. Beyond that point, size can become a burden. The empire needed money to pay soldiers, build infrastructure, supply cities, run administration, and manage the enormous ceremony of imperial power. When revenues were strong and borders stable, the system worked remarkably well. But when one part of the machine began failing, the pressure spread. Political instability was one of the first great problems. Rome had no simple, universally accepted rule for succession. An emperor might name a son. The army might proclaim a general. The Senate might approve someone after the fact. A powerful commander might simply march on the capital and see who remained loyal. During the 3rd century, this turned into something close to a recurring crisis. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed. Some ruled for years, some for months. Many died violently, killed by rivals, assassinated by their own guards, or defeated in civil wars. Every civil war consumed resources that should have defended the frontiers. Every new emperor needed to reward supporters. Every uncertain succession gave ambitious generals a reason to gamble. And the army itself was changing. Rome had always depended on military power, but the late empire needed larger and more expensive forces than ever before. The frontiers faced pressure from many directions. Persian empires challenged Rome in the east. Along the Rhine and Danube, groups known to the Romans as Goths, Franks, Alemanni, Vandals and others moved, traded, fought, and sometimes sought settlement within imperial territory. These were not one united mass called the barbarians. They were many peoples with different leaders, languages, goals, and relationships with Rome. Some fought Roman armies, some served in them, some wanted land, security, and a place inside the imperial system. Some became both enemies and allies at different moments. Meanwhile, the empire faced a quieter threat: fiscal strain. Coinage was repeatedly altered as emperors tried to meet military costs. Taxes became heavier and more rigidly collected. Farmers, merchants and local communities carried growing obligations. Inflation and disruption made ordinary life less predictable in some regions. The Roman state still had immense resources, but maintaining an empire of that scale required a constant flow of grain, silver, labour, animals, weapons and trust. Then came demographic shock. In the 2nd century, the Antonine Plague may have killed a substantial number of people across the empire. Later epidemics returned. We cannot calculate their exact toll with certainty, but disease reduced populations, weakened armies, disrupted tax collection, and changed the balance between land, labour, and state power. A civilization is not just buildings and laws, it is people able to plant fields, repair roads, collect taxes, raise children, and fill the ranks of armies. When population falls, all the systems built on population become harder to maintain. Rome adapted. That is the part the simple collapse story often misses. Emperor Diocletian, ruling at the end of the 3rd century, reorganized the state. He expanded administration, reformed taxation, strengthened the military, and divided imperial authority among several rulers. Later, Constantine founded a new imperial centre at Constantinople, on the Bosporus, closer to the wealthier and more threatened eastern provinces. The empire became more centralized, more bureaucratic, more openly Christian, and more divided between eastern and western courts. For a time, these changes worked. The 4th century was not an age of simple decline. Cities remained active, trade continued, great churches were built. Scholars wrote, administrators governed. The empire still possessed formidable armies and enormous wealth. But the western half was generally poorer, less urbanized, and harder to defend than the east. Its tax base was more fragile. Its frontiers were long. Its political leaders were often dependent on powerful military commanders. And in the late 4th and 5th centuries, pressure intensified. The arrival of the Huns in Europe set off movements among other peoples. In 376, large numbers of Goths crossed the Danube into Roman territory, seeking refuge and opportunity. Roman officials mishandled the situation badly. Hunger, exploitation, and anger turned into revolt. In 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, a Roman army was destroyed, and Emperor Valens was killed. It was a shock, but not the end. Rome recovered again. It negotiated. It recruited Gothic soldiers. It made treaties. It continued, but each recovery came with new compromises. More military power passed into the hands of non-Roman commanders. More groups were settled within imperial territory under their own leaders. Provinces that once sent taxes to Rome became harder to control. In 410, the city of Rome was sacked by the Visigoths. In 455 it was sacked again, this time by the Vandals. For people who believed Rome was eternal, these events must have felt unimaginable. Yet the old city was no longer the true centre of imperial power. Emperors in the west often ruled from Ravenna. The administrative system still functioned in many places. The Senate still met. Roman officials still wrote documents. Farmers still planted crops beneath the shadows of villas and churches. So when Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476, it was a symbol of a process already far advanced. Odoacer did not erase every Roman institution overnight. He ruled Italy while recognizing the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. Roman administrators continued their work. Roman law remained important. The Church preserved literacy, property, and networks of authority. Roads did not vanish because no emperor sat in the Western Palace, and the Eastern Empire did not fall at all. From Constantinople, Roman emperors continued to rule for nearly another 1,000 years. They called themselves Romans. Their government preserved Roman law, Roman taxation, Roman diplomacy, and Roman imperial traditions, even as Greek became increasingly dominant in public life. What we now call the Byzantine Empire was, to its own people, simply the Roman Empire. In the West, Latin did not disappear. It changed. Over generations, spoken Latin became the languages we now call Spanish, French, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, and others. Roman law shaped later legal systems. Roman Christianity became a unifying force across Europe. Roman roads continued to guide travel, trade, and armies. Roman cities survived in altered form. The empire was gone as a single Western political machine. But Rome was everywhere, in laws, in churches, in languages, in city plans, in titles, in ideas about citizenship, authority, empire, and civilization itself. This is the deeper lesson. A catastrophic event can happen inside a gradual transformation. The sack of a city is catastrophic. The defeat of an army is catastrophic. The removal of an emperor is catastrophic for the people whose world depends on that office. But civilization does not always obey the calendar. Sometimes institutions fragment and reassemble. Sometimes power moves from capitals to local rulers, bishops, landowners, merchants, and military leaders. Sometimes people preserve old habits under new names. And sometimes, centuries later, descendants look back at the ruins and decide a world ended on one particular day, because a single date is easier to remember than a long, uneven process of change. Rome did not simply collapse. It reorganized under pressure. And far to the east, in the forests of Southeast Asia, another great civilization would discover that even the most sophisticated system can become vulnerable when its relationship with water begins to change. Angkor was built around water, not merely beside it, not simply dependent on it in the ordinary way that every farming society depends on rain and rivers. Water was the organizing principle of the Khmer world. It shaped the fields, the roads, the temples, the sacred geography, and the political power of kings. Between roughly the 9th and 15th centuries, the Khmer Empire created one of the largest urban landscapes on Earth. At its centre stood Angkor in what is now Cambodia. This was not a single compact city surrounded by walls. It was a vast, low-density settlement spread across hundreds of square miles. Temples rose above forests and rice fields, Houses, ponds, embankments, roads, canals, shrines, and reservoirs connected communities across the landscape. At its height, the wider Angkor region may have supported hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps close to 1 million. And all of it rested on a difficult environmental problem. Cambodia has a monsoon climate. For part of the year, rain arrives in overwhelming quantities. Rivers swell, fields flood. Then comes the dry season, when water becomes scarce and the land can harden beneath the heat. For a farming society growing rice, this was both a gift and a danger. Too little water and crops fail. Too much water and crops fail differently. The Khmer answer was engineering on an extraordinary scale. They built huge rectangular reservoirs known as barrays. They dug canals to move water across the landscape. They raised embankments and causeways. They directed seasonal flows, stored water, drained excess water, and supplied fields during dry periods. The largest reservoirs were enormous, several miles long, holding quantities of water that would have seemed almost impossible to control with pre-modern technology. This system helped support intensive rice agriculture. More reliable harvests meant more food. More food meant more people. More people meant larger armies, more labourers, more artisans, more priests, more officials and more builders capable of creating temples like Angkor Wat and the Bayon. The temples were religious monuments, of course, but they were also political statements. A king who could command thousands of workers to quarry stone, transport it, carve it and raise it into towers shaped like mountains was showing that he possessed cosmic legitimacy. A king who could control water was doing something even more important. He was making life possible. In a world where the monsoon could bring abundance or disaster, water management was not just practical. It was proof that the king maintained order between heaven, earth and human society. For centuries, the system worked. But here's the problem with a system designed to master nature. The more successful it becomes, the more people depend on it continuing to work exactly as expected. Angkor's network required constant maintenance, canals filled with sediment. Embankments eroded, reservoir walls weakened, channels had to be cleared, repaired, adjusted and protected. A small failure in one part of a connected system could redirect water somewhere destructive. A broken spillway could damage a road. A damaged road could limit access for the workers needed to repair another canal. Infrastructure creates resilience, but it can also create rigidity. If farmers rely on a complex network rather than local rainfall alone, they become vulnerable when the network fails. If political power depends on organizing huge maintenance projects, then political weakness can become an environmental problem. And if the climate changes beyond the range a system was designed to handle, even brilliant engineering may begin to work against itself. Evidence from tree rings and cave deposits suggests that mainland Southeast Asia experienced major climate instability during the 14th and 15th centuries. There were long droughts, possibly lasting decades, interrupted by periods of exceptionally intense monsoon rain. Imagine what that would mean for Angkor. During drought, reservoirs would fall, canals would carry less water, rice yields would decline. Food shortages could spread through a population built around dependable harvests. Then, after years of dryness, violent rains could arrive and hit soils, channels and embankments that were no longer prepared to absorb them. Archaeologists have found signs of erosion and damage in parts of Angkor's water system. Some canals appear to have been altered or repaired. Others may have become choked, bypassed or overwhelmed. The exact sequence is still debated. We cannot point to one broken dam and say, this ended Angkor. But the larger pattern is clear enough. A highly interconnected hydraulic landscape was under pressure from climate extremes. And climate was not the only problem. The Khmer Empire faced political tensions, shifting trade routes, and military rivals. To the west, the growing kingdom of Ayutthaya became a serious competitor. In 1431, Ayutthayan forces captured Angkor. This was an important event, but it was not a single clean moment of abandonment. The region remained inhabited. Temples continued to be used. People did not vanish into the jungle overnight. Instead, political power gradually moved southward toward the Mekong River and the region around Phnom Penh. That shift made sense. The Mekong connected Cambodia more directly to expanding maritime trade networks. As commerce increasingly moved through coastal and riverine routes, an inland capital dependent on its old agricultural infrastructure may have become less advantageous. So what happened to Angkor? Not one thing. Drought stressed food production. Floods damaged infrastructure. Maintenance became harder. Rival states applied military pressure. Trade patterns changed. Political authority shifted. People adapted, moved, rebuilt, and chose different centres of power. Angkor was not defeated by water alone. It was transformed because its relationship with water had changed. And that is the unsettling part. The Khmer built one of history's greatest systems for managing a difficult environment. For generations, that mastery created wealth, power, and stability. But the same scale that made the system impressive also made it demanding. It needed coordination, labour, predictable seasons, institutions capable of responding quickly when something went wrong. When those conditions changed, the system did not simply protect the society that depended on it. It became another thing that had to be saved. Angkor reminds us that civilization is often strongest where it has learned to manage risk. But it is also most exposed when it forgets that management is not the same as control. And sometimes the greatest achievement of a civilization becomes the structure it can no longer afford to maintain. And yet, even when a civilization seems to leave behind a warning written in stone, the warning may not mean what we think it means. Few places have attracted more collapse stories than Rapa Nui, the small volcanic island in the southeastern Pacific, known to much of the world as Easter Island. It is one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth. The nearest large landmass lies thousands of miles away across open ocean, and scattered around its coastline stand nearly 1,000 massive stone figures, the Moai. They are among the most recognizable monuments in human history. Long faces, heavy brows, elongated ears, bodies often buried beneath the soil. Some stand on ceremonial platforms called a hu, facing inland toward the communities they represented. Others remain unfinished in the volcanic quarry of Rano Raraku, as if the workers had simply put down their tools and walked away. For generations, these statues seem to tell a simple and haunting story. A Polynesian people arrive on a small island rich in palms, birds, and coastal resources. Their population grows, rival clans compete to build larger and larger statues. Forests are cut down to move the Moai, soil erodes. Crops fail, warfare spreads, the statues fall, society collapses. It is a powerful story because it feels so complete. A tiny world, limited resources, human ambition, environmental destruction, final ruin, and it has often been used as a miniature version of Earth itself. Rapa Nui as a warning that humanity, given enough time, will cut down its last tree while arguing about who gets to build the biggest monument. But the more closely archaeologists, ecologists, and Rapa Nui researchers have examined the island, the less certain that simple story becomes. The people of Rapa Nui were Polynesian navigators, part of one of the greatest maritime expansions in human history. Their ancestors had crossed enormous distances through the Pacific, using deep knowledge of stars, winds, currents, clouds, birds, and ocean swells. They likely reached the island sometime around the late 1st millennium or early 2nd millennium, though the precise date remains debated. They did not arrive as helpless castaways. They arrived carrying crops adapted to island life. Sweet potatoes, taro, yams, bananas, sugar cane, chickens, and the knowledge needed to make a society in a demanding place. They created villages, gardens, ceremonial centres, and social traditions tied to ancestry and kinship. The Moai were part of that world. They were not simply vanity projects. They represented revered ancestors, powerful chiefs and lineages. Raised on stone platforms, many looked toward the settlements rather than out toward the sea. Their presence may have connected the living community to those who had come before, making ancestry visible in the landscape. Building them required labour and organisation, but labour devoted to monuments is not automatically evidence of madness. Every civilization in this story has built structures that consume time, energy and resources. Temples, pyramids, palaces, cathedrals, walls, monument building can be competition. It can also be cooperation, religious devotion, political legitimacy, and a way of binding people together. There is no question that Rapa Nui's environment changed dramatically after settlement. The island's great palm forests disappeared. Several species of birds vanished. Soils were altered, wood became scarce, but the causes and timing remain more complicated than the old story allowed. Human clearing almost certainly mattered. So did the Polynesian rat, accidentally or intentionally introduced by settlers, which may have eaten palm seeds and made forest regeneration difficult. And rather than simply exhausting their land and giving up, the islanders developed methods to keep producing food. Across Rapa Nui, researchers have found evidence of rock gardens and stone mulching. Broken volcanic rock was spread across agricultural areas, helping retain moisture, reduce wind damage, moderate soil temperature, and release minerals over time. In some places, people built enclosed garden spaces, sometimes called manavai, that sheltered crops from wind and created more manageable growing conditions. This was not the behaviour of people who had forgotten how to adapt. It was the behaviour of people learning, over generations, how to survive on a dry, windy, isolated island with limited soil and uncertain rainfall. That does not mean life was easy. It does not mean there were no conflicts, shortages, or social changes. The production of moai appears to have stopped before Europeans arrived, and many statues were later toppled. Oral traditions and archaeological evidence suggest periods of tension and transformation. But a change in religious or political practice is not necessarily a total societal collapse. Societies can stop building monuments without ceasing to exist. Then in 1722, Dutch sailors arrived. They were followed by other European visitors, traders, missionaries, and colonial powers. In the 19th century came one of the most devastating events in Rapa Nui history, Peruvian slave raids. In 1862 and 1863, raiders seized a large portion of the island's population, including leaders and people with essential cultural knowledge. Some captives were eventually returned, but they brought disease with them. Smallpox and other introduced illnesses spread through a community with no immunity. The population crashed to a tiny fraction of what it had been. Later came outside control over land, livestock, and political life. Rapa Nui people were confined, marginalised, and separated from much of their ancestral landscape. This matters because the old collapse story often placed nearly all the tragedy on the islanders themselves. It turned a living people into a cautionary fable. It looked at toppled statues and assumed that the most important disaster had happened before outsiders arrived. But for the people of Rapa Nui, the most clearly documented demographic catastrophe came with slavery, disease, and colonial disruption. The island still offers lessons about environmental limits. Of course it does. No society can ignore damaged ecosystems forever. But it offers an equally important lesson about the stories we choose to tell. Simple collapse narratives are attractive because they give us a clean moral. Cut down trees, build foolish monuments, suffer the consequences. The past becomes a mirror in which we see exactly what we already fear about ourselves. But history is rarely that neat. Environmental change can be real. Human mistakes can be real, and resilience can be real at the same time. People can damage a landscape while also inventing ways to live within its limits. They can face hardship without disappearing. They can be transformed by outside violence long after later observers have decided their story was already over. Rapa Nui does not tell us that environmental warnings are false. It tells us to be careful when turning the past into a single warning. Because the ruins are real, the missing forests are real. The statues are real, but so are the gardens, the survival strategies, the descendants, and the colonial wounds that followed. And if we want to understand what happens when civilizations change, we have to listen for all of it. But even when we listen carefully, something in us still wants there to be more. Not just a ruined city, or a damaged island, or an empire that slowly lost its grip. We want the lost continent. We want the drowned kingdom beneath the waves, the library sealed in a cave, the ancient people who knew something we have forgotten. We want Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu, and all the vanished worlds that seem to hover just beyond the edge of the historical record. It is easy to understand why. The ocean covers most of the planet. It hides shipwrecks, coastlines, settlements, and entire landscapes that were once dry land. Before modern divers, sonar surveys, and satellite mapping, the sea was almost the perfect place to put a mystery. Anything could be down there, a palace, a civilization, a warning, and sometimes something really is. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose by more than 120 meters, around 400 feet, as vast ice sheets melted. Coastlines moved inward, river valleys flooded, low plains disappeared beneath shallow seas. Places where people had hunted, gathered shellfish, built camps, and perhaps made seasonal settlements now lie underwater. The floor of the North Sea between Britain and continental Europe was once part of a broad lowland landscape often called Doggerland. People lived there when it was crossed by rivers, lakes, and forests. Parts of Southeast Asia were once connected by land. The Persian Gulf may have contained habitable plains before rising waters filled it. Along coasts all over the world, evidence of early human life may now be inaccessible beneath waves and sediment. So the basic feeling behind flood stories is not foolish. The world really did flood, at least from the perspective of people living near ancient shorelines. A child born near a familiar river mouth might grow old watching the sea creep farther inland. A hunting ground could vanish. A village site could become a tidal marsh. Generations later, the details might blur, but the memory could remain. The land was there. Then the water came. That is the shape of a myth. Flood traditions appear in many cultures. There is the Mesopotamian story of Utnapishtim, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh. There is the biblical story of Noah. There is the Greek story of Deucalion. There are flood stories from South Asia, East Asia, the Pacific, the Americas, and Australia. They are not all the same story, and there is no good evidence that they preserve a single global flood that covered every mountain on Earth. But they may preserve something more human and more believable. People remember disasters. A devastating river flood can become a story told for centuries. A tsunami can be remembered in oral tradition long after the coastline has changed. In some indigenous Australian traditions, researchers have suggested that Memories of rising seas may have been passed down for thousands of years. That possibility is remarkable, though difficult to prove in every case. Oral traditions change. They gather meaning. They become sacred. They are not newspapers from the ancient past, but neither are they meaningless. They can carry the emotional truth of an event, the water rising, the homes lost, the survivors searching for higher ground, the knowledge that the world people trusted was not permanent after all. And if you enjoy these kinds of mysteries, the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries is available on the website. The link is in the description. It explores the strange places where evidence, uncertainty, and imagination meet, which is exactly where we are standing now. Because the most famous lost world of all began not with a map or a submerged ruin, but with a philosopher. Atlantis appears in 2 dialogues written by Plato around the 4th century BCE, the Timaeus and the Critias. In his account, Atlantis was a powerful island civilization beyond the Pillars of Heracles, usually identified with the Strait of Gibraltar. It was rich, organized, ambitious, and militarily dangerous. Then, after falling into moral corruption, it was destroyed in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods. It is an unforgettable story, but Plato was not writing modern history. He was using stories to explore political and moral ideas. Atlantis stands opposite an idealized ancient Athens. One society becomes greedy, imperial, and corrupt. The other remains virtuous and disciplined. The catastrophe is not just geology. It is philosophy with earthquakes. Could Plato have drawn inspiration from real events? Possibly. The eruption of Thera, now Santorini, devastated parts of the Aegean world more than 1,000 years before Plato lived. Ancient memories of earthquakes, tsunamis, and ruined cities may have circulated in Greek culture, but no archaeological evidence has confirmed Atlantis as the advanced island empire Plato described. The uncertainty is important. A disaster can inspire a legend. A legend can become a moral story, and a moral story can eventually be mistaken for a lost chapter of history. Lemuria followed a different path. In the 19th century, before plate tectonics was understood, some scientists proposed a hypothetical land bridge in the Indian Ocean to explain the distribution of animals such as lemurs. The idea was later abandoned when continental drift provided a far better explanation. But Lemuria survived in occult writing, speculative fiction, and claims about an ancient vanished civilization. The continent disappeared from science. The myth kept going. This is what makes forgotten worlds so powerful. They offer a flattering possibility. Maybe the past was not poorer, stranger, and more difficult than we imagine. Maybe someone before us had machines, secret wisdom, impossible knowledge. Maybe they rose higher than we have risen, then vanished so completely that only hints remain. It is a comforting thought in a strange way. If others were here before us, then perhaps we are not the first people to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the world. But evidence matters precisely because wonder matters. There are real drowned landscapes, real ancient floods, real cities buried by ash, mud, sand, and time. There are mysteries still waiting beneath the sea and beneath modern streets. Archaeology does not make the past less astonishing. It makes it more astonishing, because the things we can prove are already extraordinary. We do not need a vanished global empire to be humbled by the people who crossed oceans without maps, remembered coastlines after they disappeared, or rebuilt after the rivers changed course. The forgotten world is not always an impossible continent. Sometimes it is simply the real past, partly submerged, partly broken, and waiting patiently for us to learn how to read what remains. And that is the difficult part. The past is not silent because nobody lived there. It is silent because most of what people made, knew, loved, argued about, cooked, wore, sang, and recorded was never designed to survive thousands of years. Civilizations do not usually forget everything at once. They forget in layers. First, a road is no longer repaired. Then a workshop closes. Then the people who know how to make a particular kind of glass, dye, metal tool, or ship dye without training enough replacements. A temple loses its priests. A court loses its scribes. A language changes. A script becomes strange marks on a wall. And eventually, even if the words are still physically there, nobody can read them. This happened with Linear B. Linear B was a writing system used in Mycenaean Greece during the Late Bronze Age, roughly from 1450 to 1200 BCE. It was written mostly on small clay tablets, records of palace administration, lists of sheep, jars of oil, grain deliveries, land assignments, names of workers, the ordinary machinery of a complex society. The tablets were not meant to last. They were damp clay, probably kept only as temporary records in palace archives. At the end of the year, they could have been recycled. But when some Mycenaean palaces burned, the heat baked the tablets hard. Fire destroyed the institutions that made the records useful, but accidentally preserved the records themselves. It is one of history's strange little jokes. The palaces vanished. The scribal system vanished. Knowledge of the script vanished. For more than 3,000 years, Linear B sat unread in the ground. Archaeologists found the tablets in the modern era, but finding writing is not the same thing as understanding writing. It took until 1952, when Michael Ventris, working with others including John Chadwick, showed that Linear B recorded an early form of Greek. Suddenly, lists that had been meaningless scratches became voices from a vanished palace world. But imagine all the things those tablets did not tell us. They tell us about rations and taxes, chariots and livestock. They tell us much less about what an ordinary farmer thought while planting barley. They do not preserve every story told beside a hearth, every local song, every private joke, every argument between neighbours. The archive survives because it belonged to power. And even that survival was an accident. This is how the archaeological record works. Not as a complete library of the past, but as a tiny damaged selection shaped by chance. Stone survives better than wood. Pottery survives better than cloth. Gold survives better than bread. A monumental temple can endure as foundations and fallen blocks, while the homes around it, built from timber, mud brick, reeds and thatch, dissolve almost completely. Future archaeologists may find the palace and conclude that the palace was everything. But it was not. The palace depended on farmers, builders, boatmen, potters, weavers, cooks, herders, miners, healers, children and old people. It depended on forests cut for beams, fields planted with grain, animals raised for wool, water carried in jars, and thousands of daily tasks too small to be carved into stone. Most human life is made of perishable things. Textiles can vanish. Leather can vanish. Wooden houses can vanish. Food disappears unless it is charred, dried, frozen, or sealed away under unusual conditions. Entire libraries written on papyrus, bark, bamboo, palm leaves, wax tablets, or paper can become dust, ash, mould, or insect food. Even stone does not explain itself. An inscription may remain, but the language may be dead. A statue may survive, but its god may be forgotten, and surviving objects can be misunderstood. Archaeologists are careful about this, because objects do not arrive with neat labels attached. A ceremonial vessel may look like a kitchen pot. A child's toy may be mistaken for a religious object. A broken tool may be interpreted as a weapon. A burial object may reveal genuine belief, or it may reflect one family's custom during one brief period in one small place. The past is not only buried, it is translated through our own assumptions. Think about what future people might make of us. After centuries of abandonment, they might find concrete foundations, tunnels, bridges, dams, fragments of glass, mountains of plastic, corroded machines, and the strange mineral traces of industry. They might find coins, though perhaps not understand how little cash mattered in the final decades of a digital economy. They might find sports stadiums and assume they were temples. They might find airports and struggle to imagine the speed with which people once crossed oceans. They may find millions of books if those books stay dry and protected. But much of our knowledge now lives in forms that are far more fragile than stone tablets. A hard drive without power is not a library. A cloud is not a cloud. It is a vast network of machines, cables, cooling systems, data centers, software, passwords, formats, and institutions. Keep the system alive, and information can be copied endlessly. Let the system fail for long enough, and an enormous archive may become unreadable noise. So when we ask whether a civilization can disappear, the answer is not simply yes or no. Its buildings may remain. Its debris may remain, its stories may remain in distorted fragments. But its meaning can fade much faster, and that brings us to an uncomfortable question. If our cities fell quiet, if no one maintained the servers, the roads, the power grids, the archives, and the specialized knowledge that holds them together, what exactly would remain of the world we think is permanent? The answer begins with something most of us almost never see. Not a monument, not a government building, not a giant factory with smoke pouring from its roof. A system. Actually thousands of systems layered on top of one another so completely that they disappear into the background of ordinary life. You wake up and the room is warm or cool because electricity moved through a grid of power stations, transmission lines, substations, transformers, wires, meters and switches. You turn on a tap and water arrives. It may have fallen as rain months ago in a distant watershed, flowed into a reservoir, passed through treatment plants, filtration systems, chemical testing, pumping stations, and miles of underground pipe before reaching your glass. You make coffee. The beans may have been grown on a hillside thousands of miles away. The machine was assembled from metals mined on several continents. The electricity came from coal, gas, uranium, wind, sunlight, falling water, or some combination of all of them. The cup may have crossed an ocean in a container ship. The milk came from a farm, then a processing plant, then a refrigerated truck, then a warehouse, then a store whose shelves are replenished by software predicting what people in your neighborhood might buy this week. And all of this happened before breakfast. Modern civilization is not just cities and skyscrapers. It is a vast machine for moving energy, water, materials, food, information, money, and medicine through billions of human lives. Fuel moves ships, trucks, tractors, aircraft, mining machines, generators, ambulances, and construction equipment. Electricity powers homes, factories, hospitals, pumps, communications networks, refrigeration, and the invisible computers that coordinate much of the whole arrangement. Water systems keep cities alive not only by providing drinking water, but by carrying away waste, cooling industrial equipment, irrigating crops, and supporting the sanitation that prevents disease from spreading through dense populations. Then there is food. A large ancient city depended on farmers beyond its walls. Rome relied on grain shipments from provinces around the Mediterranean. Angkor depended on rice fields and water management. Every civilization has needed a way to bring calories from the countryside into crowded places. But the scale is different now. A modern city may be fed by farms, fishing fleets, fertilizer plants, grain elevators, rail networks, cold storage warehouses, ports, highways, shipping companies, wholesalers, supermarkets, and digital payment systems scattered across an entire planet. A tomato picked in one country can be packed in another, processed in a third and eaten in a fourth. A drought in one region, a blocked canal, a fuel shortage, a disease outbreak among livestock, or a strike at a major port can ripple outward through places that have never heard of each other. This is called interdependence, and it is one of the great achievements of our species. It allows a city dweller to eat food grown far away, receive medicines invented by strangers, speak instantly to someone across an ocean, and rely on tools so complex that no single person could make them from raw materials. A modern hospital is not just a building full of doctors. It depends on trained nurses, surgeons, pharmacists, laboratory technicians, cleaners, engineers, software specialists, manufacturers, electricity workers, water workers, fuel suppliers, and transport crews. It depends on antibiotics made in specialized facilities, sterile gloves produced somewhere else, replacement parts delivered on schedule, and records stored in systems that must remain available when seconds matter. The same is true of almost everything around us. Your phone is a small miracle of specialization. Its glass, metals, chemicals, microchips, batteries, code, and networks represent the work of millions of people, most of whom will never meet. A single individual could learn to grow food, build a shelter, make simple tools, perhaps even generate a little power. But few of us could mine copper, refine silicon, manufacture antibiotics, repair a satellite, operate a water treatment plant, and produce the components of a computer from scratch. Modern life makes us extraordinarily capable together. It also makes us difficult to reproduce alone. This is not necessarily a weakness. Ancient societies were not truly self-sufficient either. A village depended on rain, soil, animals, neighbouring communities, trade routes, and shared knowledge. The difference is that many older economies were more local. If a distant road became dangerous, a farming village might still have nearby grain, nearby water, familiar craftspeople, and tools repaired by people it knew. Modern supply chains are often more efficient than resilient in the old-fashioned sense. They are designed to keep goods moving continuously, with warehouses carrying less surplus than they once did. This is often called just-in-time logistics. Instead of storing months of materials, companies may receive parts exactly when they are needed. It saves space, reduces costs, and works remarkably well when ports are open, fuel is available, communications are functioning, and everyone along the chain can keep doing their job. But when one link breaks, the absence becomes visible very quickly. A power outage is not only darkness, it can mean stopped pumps, closed gas stations, spoiled food, silent traffic lights, weakened phone networks, inaccessible bank cards, and hospitals switching to backup generators. A fuel disruption is not only trouble at the filling station, it affects tractors, freight, heating, emergency services, and the delivery of everything else. A cyber attack on a payment network can turn a fully stocked store into a place where goods cannot easily be bought. A damaged bridge, an overwhelmed port, or a broken water main can reveal how much normal life rested on infrastructure nobody had been thinking about yesterday. The systems become visible when they fail, and that may be the strangest feature of modern civilization. Its greatest accomplishments are often invisible precisely because they work so well. Clean water does not announce itself, refrigeration does not ask for gratitude, the electrical grid does not demand applause each time a light comes on. We notice the machinery only when the machinery pauses. So is this global web fragile? Sometimes, yes. Complex systems can transmit shocks over long distances. They can fail in unexpected ways because each part depends on another part. But interdependence can also create strength. A region facing crop failure can import food. A hospital short of supplies can receive aid from far away. Knowledge can travel at the speed of light. A local disaster does not have to become a total disaster if the wider network remains intact. The question is not whether dependence is good or bad. The question is how many failures the system can absorb before it stops being a network of support and becomes a chain of breakdowns. Climate change is one of those pressures that can touch almost every link at once. Not always dramatically, not always in a single obvious disaster. More often it arrives as a series of bad years, a summer a little hotter than the last one, a rainy season that starts late, a river that floods beyond its old banks, a coastal road that has to be repaired again, then again, a harvest that comes in smaller than expected, an insurance bill that rises, a reservoir that never quite refills. One event can be managed. Civilizations have always managed individual disasters. A city can rebuild after a flood. A farming region can survive one poor harvest. A country can send emergency food after a drought. The real danger comes when stresses overlap, when the systems meant to absorb one problem are already exhausted by another. Imagine a heat wave settling over a major city. At first, it seems like an inconvenience. People run air conditioners, electricity demand climbs. But extreme heat can strain power grids precisely when people need cooling most. If electricity fails, apartments become dangerous, especially for elderly people, infants, and those with chronic illnesses. Roads soften, rail lines can buckle, workers cannot safely remain outdoors. Hospitals receive more patients just as they are dealing with the same stressed grid, the same overheated buildings, the same exhausted staff. Then imagine that the heat continues into the countryside. Crops need water. Livestock need water. Rivers run lower. Reservoirs shrink. Hydroelectric power can decline at the exact moment demand for electricity rises. Farmers may pump more groundwater, drawing down aquifers that took centuries, sometimes thousands of years to fill. Food prices rise, not necessarily because all food disappears, but because the margin between ordinary supply and emergency supply becomes thinner. That margin matters. Most people do not experience climate change as a graph of global average temperatures. They experience it as the price of bread, the cost of cooling a home, a flooded basement, a cancelled train, a failed well, or a relative forced to leave a place that no longer supports a normal life. And it is not just heat. A warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapour, that can intensify heavy rainfall in many places, turning familiar storms into destructive floods. At the same time, changing weather patterns can leave other regions waiting for rain that does not come. This sounds contradictory until you remember that climate is not a single dial marked wet or dry. It is a vast moving system. More energy in the atmosphere can mean heavier downpours, stronger extremes, and less reliable seasons. For ancient societies, this kind of uncertainty was terrifying. The Akkadian Empire faced periods of severe drought. Maya cities endured changing rainfall patterns while supporting dense populations. Angkor depended on an enormous water system that may have been strained by alternating droughts and floods. In each case, environmental pressure mattered, but it was never the whole story. Politics mattered, war mattered, trade mattered, inequality mattered. Decisions made by rulers mattered. A drought does not automatically destroy a civilization. It exposes what that civilization has built to handle drought. That distinction is important now, maybe more important than ever. Modern societies possess advantages no ancient king could have imagined. We can monitor rainfall from satellites. We can measure soil moisture, track hurricanes, model floods, forecast heat waves, and watch the slow rise of seas around the world. We can move grain across oceans. We can breed more resilient crops, desalinate water, build seawalls, improve irrigation, issue warnings, evacuate cities, and coordinate aid across continents. We know far more about the danger, but knowledge alone does not build a stronger bridge, refill a reservoir, protect a neighborhood, or make food affordable. And climate pressure is not shared equally. A wealthy city may respond to rising heat with stronger power grids, shaded streets, cooling centers, better housing, and emergency services. A poor neighborhood in that same city may have none of these things. One family can leave a flood zone, buy insurance, and rebuild. Another may lose everything in a single night and have nowhere else to go. The same is true between nations. Some countries have contributed relatively little to the gases warming the planet, yet face some of the earliest and harshest consequences. Low-lying island nations confront sea level rise that threatens fresh water, farmland, roads, ports, and eventually entire communities. Dry regions may face deeper water stress. Countries whose economies depend heavily on rain-fed agriculture can be hit hard by a failed season. Meanwhile, richer nations often have more money, more infrastructure, and more room to adapt. Climate change is therefore not only an environmental problem, it is a problem of geography, wealth, power, history, and justice. Sea level rise offers a quiet example. The ocean does not need to swallow a city overnight to transform it. Higher seas can push storm surges farther inland. Salt water can creep into soils and freshwater supplies. Drainage systems designed for an older coastline may stop working. A flood that used to happen once in a century may begin happening every few years. Eventually, people and businesses may leave, not because one final wave destroyed everything, but because rebuilding no longer makes economic sense. That is how pressure becomes migration. And migration, like drought, is not automatically a crisis. Human beings have always moved in response to opportunity and danger. Movement can bring skills, labour, trade, and renewal. But when large numbers of people are forced to move quickly into places already struggling with housing, employment, water, or political tension, the pressure can spread outward. This is where the modern machine becomes both vulnerable and powerful. A failed harvest in one country does not have to mean famine there. Food can be imported. Aid can be organised. Scientific warnings can give governments time to prepare. But if several major agricultural regions suffer at once, if fuel costs rise, if ports are damaged, if governments restrict exports, if prices trigger unrest, then a climate shock can become an economic shock, then a political shock, then something harder to contain. A cascading crisis, not inevitable, not automatic, but possible. The lesson from older collapses is not that nature always wins, or that humans are helpless before a changing sky. It is that resilience has to be built before the emergency. It means storing water before drought, maintaining flood defences before storms, protecting wetlands, soils, forests, and coastlines before they are needed, designing cities that can survive heat, keeping food systems diverse, making sure warnings reach the people most at risk. And perhaps most difficult of all, cooperating before fear turns every neighbour into a competitor, because climate stress tests more than roads, crops, and power lines. It tests whether a civilization can remember that its strongest defences are shared. Shared defences matter in a pandemic too. A disease outbreak begins inside bodies. A cough, a fever, a wound that will not heal, but it never stays only biological. Once infection begins moving through a population, It travels along the same routes that make civilization possible. Roads, ships, markets, armies, pilgrimage routes, crowded housing, family gatherings. The networks that carry food, ideas and wealth can also carry sickness. And sometimes the disease arrives before anyone understands what it is. In the middle of the 14th century, the Black Death moved across Eurasia and North Africa with terrible speed. It was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, often transmitted through fleas associated with rodents, though the exact paths of transmission varied. It reached Mediterranean ports, entered towns and villages, and spread through communities that had no knowledge of bacteria, no antibiotics, and no reliable way to stop it. The death toll was enormous. Historians still debate the precise numbers, because medieval records are incomplete, and because different regions suffered differently. But in much of Europe, perhaps a third to half of the population died between the late 1340s and early 1350s. Some places lost less, others lost far more. Whole households vanished. Farms were abandoned. Clergy died while tending the sick. Experienced workers, judges, merchants, craftsmen, and local officials disappeared in numbers that were difficult to replace. Picture a village after that. Fields still need planting. Animals still need feeding, roofs still leak, taxes are still demanded. But the people who knew how to do these things may be gone. A community is not just buildings and land. It is memory. It is the baker who knows the oven, the farmer who knows which field floods first, the midwife, the carpenter, the person who remembers where the boundary markers are buried. When enough people die at once, institutions can become strangely hollow. A kingdom may still have a king. A church may still have its churches. A city may still have its walls, its laws, its market square. But the daily machinery of life slows down. Courts cannot function normally. Land cannot be worked normally. Trade contracts become uncertain. Old obligations begin to break apart because there are simply not enough surviving people to enforce them. And yet, this is where the story becomes more complicated. Population decline can create opportunities for the survivors. After the Black Death, labour became scarce in many parts of Europe. Landowners who had once commanded an abundance of workers found themselves competing for peasants and labourers. Wages rose in some regions. Survivors could sometimes demand better terms, move to new places, or take over land that had once been beyond their reach. The old feudal order did not vanish overnight. It remained powerful, and elites often tried to freeze wages or restrict movement. But the balance had changed. For a worker who had lived under constant scarcity, the death of millions could mean, in a grim and terrible way, a little more bargaining power. That is one of the hardest truths about population shocks. They are disasters. They bring grief, fear, and irreversible loss. But they also rearrange society. Empty land becomes available. Inheritances shift. Labour becomes valuable. Old families lose power. New people rise. Economic systems that seemed permanent reveal themselves to be temporary arrangements held together by population, confidence, and habit. Belief changes too during the Black Death. Many people searched desperately for meaning. Some turned more intensely toward religion. Some believed the plague was divine punishment. Some lost faith in religious authorities who could not explain or stop it. Others looked for human targets to blame. Jewish communities were falsely accused of causing the disease and suffered horrific persecution across parts of Europe. Foreigners, beggars, travellers, and anyone seen as different could become objects of suspicion. This is another pattern that repeats. When people do not understand a threat, fear looks for a face. Disease can turn ordinary caution into isolation. Isolation can become mistrust. Mistrust can survive long after the outbreak itself has faded. Families may avoid one another. Communities may remember who fled, who stayed, who hoarded food, who offered help, who profited while others suffered. These memories can become stories told for generations, shaping local identity long after the graves have disappeared. The pandemic of the early 21st century gave the modern world its own version of this experience. It was not the Black Death. Modern medicine, sanitation, global communication, vaccines, and intensive care prevented a far worse outcome than earlier societies might have faced. And yet the disruption was still vast. Schools closed, hospitals filled, travel stopped, supply chains faltered. Offices emptied, millions of people lost work, lost relatives, or spent months separated from friends and family. For a while, much of the planet experienced the same strange realization. The world economy is not an abstract machine floating above ordinary life. It depends on people showing up: drivers, nurses, warehouse workers, teachers, farmers, cleaners, engineers, caregivers. When illness or quarantine removes enough people from their usual places, even temporarily, systems that looked permanent can become fragile very quickly. But a global pandemic is not proof that collapse is inevitable. It is evidence that disruption can be global and that recovery depends on choices. Public health systems matter. Honest information matters. Scientific institutions matter. Trust matters. Vaccines, clean water, testing, ventilation, hospitals, and trained health workers are not glamorous monuments. They are among the quiet foundations of a functioning civilization. So is mutual care. A society survives a disease outbreak not only through laboratories and emergency laws, but through people bringing food to neighbours, protecting the vulnerable, sharing accurate information, staying home when necessary, and refusing the easy comfort of blaming one another. Because after the fever passes, the deeper question remains: what will people remember about how they were treated? And if disease can expose the hidden weaknesses of a civilization, war can do something even faster. War can do something even faster. A drought may take decades to weaken a kingdom. A pandemic may move in waves, leaving time for fear, adaptation, and recovery. Even the collapse of a great empire usually unfolds through years of political failure, shrinking trade, unpaid soldiers, lost territory, and institutions that slowly stop working. Industrial war can compress all of that. In a single night, a city can lose its homes, bridges, factories, power stations, hospitals, records, and people. In a few weeks, a country can burn through stores of fuel, medicine, food, and ammunition that took years to build. Railways can be cut, ports can be blockaded, fields can become battlefields. Skilled workers can be drafted, displaced, injured, or killed. The complex systems that keep modern life running can be damaged faster than any government can repair them. Earlier societies knew terrible war. They knew siege, massacre, famine, slavery, and the destruction of cities. Ancient texts are full of burned temples and broken walls. But most armies were limited by muscle, animals, roads, weather, and the amount of food they could carry. A general could devastate a region. He could destroy a capital. But he could not usually erase the industrial capacity of an entire continent in an afternoon. The 20th century changed the scale. Artillery could bombard cities from miles away. Aircraft could cross borders and drop explosives on people who never saw an enemy soldier. Firebombing turned dense urban neighbourhoods into furnaces. Modern warfare became a contest not only between armies, but between factories, rail lines, oil fields, farms, laboratories, and civilian populations. Then came the weapon that made every earlier measure of destruction seem almost local: Nuclear weapons, the first atomic bombs used in war, were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Their immediate effects were catastrophic. A single bomb could destroy much of a city centre in seconds. The blast crushed buildings, heat ignited fires and caused severe burns. Radiation injured and killed people long after the explosion. Survivors carried scars, illness, grief and memory through the rest of their lives. And those were early weapons. The nuclear arsenals built during the Cold War became far more powerful, and they were joined to missiles, submarines, bombers and warning systems designed to act with extraordinary speed. The danger was no longer simply that one city might be destroyed. It was that political leaders, under conditions of terror and uncertainty, might unleash weapons capable of killing millions and transforming the global environment. This created a problem no ancient civilization had ever faced. The tools of destruction became powerful enough to threaten not just an enemy army, not just a rival capital, but the shared conditions that make civilization possible. Food production, climate stability, clean water, public health, international trade, the ordinary confidence that tomorrow will resemble today. Deterrence emerged as the answer. The basic idea is bleak but simple. If two nuclear-armed states know that attacking the other would bring an unbearable retaliation, neither side should begin a nuclear war. This logic is often called mutually assured destruction. It helped shape decades of Cold War strategy. The fact that nuclear weapons have not been used in war since 1945 is important. Deterrence, diplomacy, arms control, and sheer caution have all mattered. But deterrence is not the same thing as safety. It depends on leaders making careful decisions during moments when information may be incomplete. It depends on communication lines staying open. It depends on machines working correctly, officers following procedures, and people recognizing a false alarm before it becomes an irreversible order. There have been moments when warning systems produced alarming signals that turned out not to be attacks. There have been military exercises that frightened rival states. There have been crises in which leaders considered options that from a distance seem almost impossible to imagine. History does not tell us that catastrophe is certain. It tells us that catastrophe has sometimes been avoided by judgment, restraint, luck, and a few individuals refusing to assume the worst. And in a nuclear crisis, time becomes its own enemy. A drought gives a society seasons to respond. A plague may give doctors and communities weeks to recognize a pattern. A missile warning can demand decisions in minutes. The faster the weapons, the shorter the space for doubt, diplomacy and human wisdom. Even a limited nuclear exchange could have consequences far beyond the places directly struck. Scientists have studied the possibility that smoke from burning cities could rise high into the atmosphere, reducing sunlight and disrupting rainfall. The exact severity would depend on the number, size, and targets of the weapons used. There is uncertainty in the models, as there is in any attempt to predict a disaster that has never happened on such a scale. But the broad concern is serious. A nuclear war could damage agriculture far from the battlefield, creating food shortages across borders that were never part of the conflict. Radiation would not respect those borders either, nor would panic, nor would financial collapse, nor would the movement of refugees escaping destroyed cities and contaminated land. Modern civilization is deeply interconnected. That connection makes it productive in peaceful times. It also means that a shock in one region can spread outward through shipping, grain markets, energy supplies, banking systems, communications networks, and the simple human need for safety. Still, it is important not to turn risk into prophecy. A large-scale nuclear war is not an inevitable chapter in history. Human beings have made choices to reduce danger before. Treaties have limited certain weapons. Diplomats have created channels for communication. International agreements have reduced arsenals from their Cold War peaks, even if enormous destructive capacity remains. The same species that invented these weapons has also built institutions intended to prevent their use. That may be the central modern question. If a major conflict shattered the systems we depend on, what would remain? Some knowledge would survive in books, libraries, laboratories, and digital archives, if they could be protected and powered. Some would survive in people, surgeons, farmers, electricians, engineers, water treatment workers, teachers, mechanics, and parents teaching children how to make life continue. Some institutions might endure locally even if national systems failed. A town council, a hospital staff, a religious community. A food cooperative, a group of neighbours who know where the wells are, how to repair a generator, and who needs help first. Civilization is not only stored in monuments or databases, it lives in habits of cooperation, in rules that restrain violence, in the difficult practice of treating strangers as people whose future matters too. Because the most frightening thing about modern destruction is not merely how much it can ruin. It is how quickly it can turn a world of immense knowledge into a world struggling to remember how its own machines once worked. And that brings us to one of the strangest weaknesses of the modern world. We have created more records than any civilization in history. More letters, photographs, maps, measurements, stories, financial accounts, scientific papers, family memories, arguments, jokes, songs, and private thoughts than all previous generations combined. But much of it may be harder to preserve than a clay tablet. Think about that for a moment. A Sumerian accountant pressed marks into wet clay 5,000 years ago. The tablet dried. Sometimes it was baked by accident when a building burned. And today, after empires rose and vanished, after languages were forgotten and rediscovered, archaeologists can still hold that accountant's record in their hands. A list of grain rations, a record of sheep, a shipment of beer. Nothing glamorous, but readable, durable, physical. A Roman inscription carved into stone can survive rain, war, and centuries of neglect. A medieval manuscript can sit quietly in a monastery library for 800 years. A printed book, if kept dry and protected from insects and fire, can be read by anyone who understands its language. No password required, no software update, no licensing agreement. No server connection, no electricity. Now compare that to a photograph stored on a phone. The image may look permanent, it may be copied to the cloud, sent to relatives, posted online, backed up automatically without anyone thinking about it. But the photograph depends on a long chain of invisible systems. The phone needs power. The file needs to remain uncorrupted. The storage device needs to function. The operating system needs to recognize the format. The account needs to remain accessible. The company holding the backup needs to continue operating. The data center needs electricity, cooling, technicians, replacement parts, network connections, and a financial reason to keep maintaining all of it. Break enough links in that chain, and the photograph is still there in some technical sense. But it may as well be buried. This is the paradox of the digital age. We have made memory abundant, cheap, searchable, and almost limitless. But we have also made much of it dependent on machines that become obsolete with astonishing speed. Remember floppy disks, VHS tapes, compact disks, zip drives, early digital cameras, old hard drives with strange connectors. There are archives from only a few decades ago that can no longer be easily opened, not because the information has vanished, but because the devices needed to read it are gone, or because the programs that understood the files no longer exist. A clay tablet does not need a clay tablet reader. A book does not stop working because its manufacturer goes bankrupt. Digital information is different. It is not simply an object. It is a relationship between data, hardware, software, energy, and human knowledge. Remove any one of these for long enough and the archive begins to fade. Even when the machines remain, files can fail quietly. Storage media degrade, bits flip, magnetic surfaces weaken. Solid-state drives can lose data over time. A damaged database may open normally while hiding small errors inside it. One missing piece of code can make an old scientific dataset difficult to interpret. One forgotten password can lock away a family archive more effectively than any ancient tomb door. And then there is the problem of ownership. Much of modern memory does not sit in our homes. It lives on servers owned by companies. Our messages, photographs, documents, purchases, location histories, music libraries, and social connections may exist in enormous warehouses of computers somewhere beyond the horizon. We call it the cloud, which makes it sound weightless and eternal. But the cloud is made of buildings. It is made of cables under oceans, substations, diesel generators, air conditioning units, lithium batteries, routers, cooling water, security guards, software engineers, and contracts. It is a physical system with a very large electricity bill. In an ordinary crisis, this system is remarkably resilient. Data is copied across multiple locations. Major companies build redundancy into their networks. Libraries, universities, governments, and preservation groups make backups. The Internet was designed in part to root around damage. A local failure does not necessarily mean global amnesia, but a long disruption would be different. If power became unreliable for months or years, data centers would not simply float above the crisis. Backup generators run on fuel. Replacement components come through supply chains. Networks need repair crews. Servers need constant management. And digital storage, unlike a sealed jar of tablets in the ground, is often maintained by continuous activity. It survives because civilization is already functioning. So what parts of the Internet might outlast a serious reset? Probably not everything people imagine. The endless stream of social media posts, temporary videos, abandoned websites, private messages, streaming catalogues and commercial databases could disappear quickly if the platforms that host them failed. Much of the Internet is not a single library. It is a collection of rented rooms, and the owners can close the doors. Some things would have better chances. Public archives copied in many countries. Open source software stored on thousands of computers. Major scientific databases preserved by universities and national libraries. Digitized books downloaded onto local devices. The Internet Archive and similar institutions. Wikipedia, which exists not only as a website, but in downloadable copies that can fit on relatively modest storage devices. But even then, survival is not the same as usefulness. Imagine future communities finding a hard drive containing millions of books. If they have electricity, a working computer, compatible cables, and people who understand the languages and file formats, it could be a treasure beyond measure. If they do not, it may be as mysterious as a chest full of sealed tablets written in an unknown script. This is why modern preservation has begun to resemble an ancient instinct. We build archives, we print important documents on durable paper. We store seeds in frozen vaults. We preserve films on specialized stock. We copy data again and again, moving it from old systems to new ones before the old systems die. Some organizations place records in deep storage, in mountain vaults, in climate-controlled rooms, and in repositories designed to endure disaster. There are even projects that etch information onto metal, ceramic, and synthetic materials, meant to last far longer than ordinary electronics. Instructions for basic science, languages, maps, images. The knowledge needed to begin rebuilding, In a way, these are our monuments, not pyramids meant to proclaim the power of rulers, not triumphal arches celebrating conquest. They are quieter than that. They are messages sent forward through uncertainty. They say, we were here, we learned things, we made mistakes, and if the lights go out, perhaps someone, somewhere, will still be able to remember. But perhaps the lights would not go out all at once. That is the image we usually imagine when we think about collapse. A sudden break, one terrible day, empty highways, dark cities, silent screens, the end arriving with a date attached to it. History is usually less dramatic. More often, systems weaken in layers. A harvest fails here, a budget crisis there, a bridge repair delayed for another year, a hospital short of staff, a water system patched instead of replaced, a factory closing because one crucial component no longer arrives on time. None of these events, by themselves, looks like the end of a civilization. They look like problems, temporary problems, manageable problems, problems that people assume somebody else is already working on. And for a long time, perhaps they are. A slow reset would not necessarily begin with anarchy or ruin. It might begin with waiting for a shipment, waiting for a medical appointment, waiting for a train that used to come every 10 minutes and now comes twice a day, waiting for a road crew to repair potholes that grow deeper each winter because the local government no longer has the money, machinery or workers to fix them. The first changes might feel almost ordinary. Food would still be available, but less predictable. Familiar products might vanish from shelves for weeks, then return at a higher price. People would learn which stores receive deliveries first. They would begin keeping a little extra rice, flour, medicine, batteries, soap. Not because they believed the world was ending, exactly. Just because it seemed sensible, cars would still move through the streets, but older ones would stay on the road longer. A broken appliance that once would have been thrown away might be repaired. A phone with a cracked screen might be used for another 5 years. People would become more careful with things. That alone would mark a profound shift. Modern industrial societies are built around replacement. When something fails, a new version arrives from somewhere else. When a machine breaks, its parts are shipped across oceans. When a city needs water, food, fuel, medicine or electricity, vast systems operate mostly out of sight to make it happen. But if those systems became less reliable, life would gradually become more local. The person who knows how to repair a pump, sharpen tools, preserve food, mend clothing, fix a roof, treat an infection, or keep an old engine running would become more valuable. Not famous, perhaps, not wealthy in the old sense, but necessary. And necessary people tend to become the centre of communities. A slow reset might bring back skills that have not disappeared, only become less common. Sewing, gardening, fermenting, canning, carpentry, mechanical repair, saving seeds, reading weather signs, knowing which nearby plants are useful, which are dangerous, and where water can still be found during a dry year. None of this would mean a return to some simple past. The past was not simple, it was hard, dangerous, and often cruel. A broken bone, a bad harvest, or an infected cut could change an entire life. But people in less connected worlds developed forms of knowledge that many highly specialized societies can afford to forget. Until they cannot, informal exchange would likely grow in the spaces where formal systems withdrew. A neighbour might repair a bicycle in return for eggs. Someone with access to a working truck might carry supplies between towns. A retired nurse might become the person everyone calls first when there is an injury. Families might share generators, tools, gardens, kitchens, and information. Money would not necessarily vanish, but money is only useful when there are things to buy and systems able to deliver them. In difficult periods, trust can become another kind of currency. Who keeps their word, who shares fairly, who knows how to organize people without creating panic, who can settle an argument before it becomes a feud. These are not small abilities. They are part of the invisible machinery that keeps a society alive, and the experience would not be the same everywhere. A wealthy coastal city with aging infrastructure might face one kind of pressure. A farming region with stable rainfall might face another. Some communities could remain connected to national systems long after others were effectively left to manage alone. A place with strong local institutions, skilled workers, reliable water, and cooperative neighbours might adapt remarkably well. Another place, only a few hundred miles away, might struggle with shortages, migration, and conflict. History offers no single map of collapse, because collapse is rarely one thing. The Roman world did not disappear at the same speed in every province. The end of palace society in the Bronze Age did not mean the end of life for every village. The Maya did not abandon every city on the same day. Some places declined, some adapted, some became smaller, poorer, quieter versions of themselves. Others found new paths. A modern reset, if it came gradually, might work the same way. There could still be functioning universities in some regions, advanced medicine in others, islands of stable power, busy ports, working railways, and digital networks maintained by communities that decide they are too valuable to lose. At the same time, other areas might become more dependent on local wells, local food, local repair, and local memory. The future would not divide neatly into before and after. It would be full of overlap, solar panels beside wood stoves, smartphones charged from small batteries, online knowledge downloaded and printed in binders, farmers using satellite forecasts when the connection works, and inherited seasonal knowledge when it does not. A world not entirely modern, not entirely ancient, but unevenly both. And perhaps that is the most unsettling possibility. People living through such a transition might not recognize it at first. They might simply feel that everything has become more expensive, more fragile, more difficult to arrange. They would remember when services were faster, goods were cheaper, and distant systems seemed dependable. Their children might not remember those things at all. To them, the changed world would just be the world. That is how historical transitions often happen. Not with a single final trumpet, but with habits changing one by one. A road no longer maintained, a school closing, a market becoming local, a household learning to make do, a skill passed from grandparent to child, because there is suddenly a reason to know it. This is only one possibility among many. Modern civilization may adapt, rebuild, innovate, and avoid the deeper forms of decline that troubled earlier societies. It has resources, knowledge, and communication tools no previous civilization possessed. But if the reset came slowly, the first sign might not be ruins. It might be the sound of someone fixing something that, a few years earlier, would have been replaced. And if enough things could no longer be repaired, eventually they would become something else. They would become evidence. Imagine people living 1,000 years from now or 10,000. Not necessarily strangers to us in the biological sense. They might be our descendants. They might speak languages descended from ours, carry fragments of our stories, perhaps even preserve a few books, recordings, or technical manuals whose meanings have become uncertain. Or they might know almost nothing about us. They would walk through landscapes we thought were permanent, and try to understand what kind of people had lived there. At first, our world might seem impossible to miss. We have built on a scale few earlier civilizations could match. Cities of concrete, steel, glass, asphalt, and brick spread across entire regions. Highways cross continents, dams hold back rivers, open pit mines have cut vast terraces into mountains. Quarries, canals, rail lines, airports, landfills, pipelines, and industrial zones have reshaped the surface of the planet so extensively that future geologists would likely recognize our presence long before they found a single intact building. The ground itself would tell part of the story. In sediments, there may be sudden layers filled with materials that earlier humans never made in such quantities. Tiny plastic particles carried by wind and water, fly ash from coal burning. Concrete fragments, aluminum, industrial metals, traces of fertilizers washing from old farmland into lakes and coastal seas. Chemical compounds created in laboratories, some of them remarkably persistent. A future archaeologist digging through the remains of one of our cities might find a strange mixed layer. Broken ceramics, but also glass, rusted steel, copper wires, fragments of batteries, millions of small colourful objects made from polymers whose original forms are no longer obvious. A child's toy, a toothbrush, a bottle cap, a piece of packaging with a faded logo. To us, these are ordinary things, disposable things, things so common that we barely see them. To someone far in the future, they might be puzzles. They might find the outlines of suburban homes, their wooden frames long gone, their roofs collapsed, their rooms filled with soil and roots. They might identify kitchens from the concentration of pipes, ceramics, and metal fixtures. They might recognize roads because asphalt and crushed stone create long, unnaturally straight bands across the landscape. But would they understand what those roads were for? A highway interchange, seen after centuries of erosion and vegetation, might look like an enormous ceremonial earthwork. Multiple raised pathways curving around each other, leading nowhere obvious. The remains of parking garages could be mistaken for warehouses, fortresses, temples, or places for storing some unknown kind of tribute. And skyscrapers. For a while, some might survive as broken skeletons, their steel cores exposed after concrete has fractured and fallen away. Others would collapse, leaving dense fields of rubble. Future people might know these were buildings, but would they understand offices, apartments, elevators? The daily rhythm of millions of people travelling upward into towers, sitting under artificial light, exchanging messages with people on the other side of the world. Purpose is harder to preserve than structure. A stone temple can remain standing for 2,000 years, but the prayers spoken inside it may vanish. A palace can leave foundations, walls, and inscriptions, but the private fears of the people who lived there are usually lost. The same would be true of us. Our largest structures may survive only as questions. Then there are the places we would expect to be remembered because they matter so much now. Data centers, server farms, the physical homes of a digital civilization. At the moment, immense portions of human memory are stored in machines. Photographs, letters, maps, music, research, financial records, family messages, arguments, jokes, and instructions for almost everything. More information than any earlier civilization could have imagined. But most of it depends on a chain of conditions: electricity, cooling systems, hardware, networks, passwords, software capable of reading old file formats. People who know where the data is and what it means. Remove enough links from that chain, and the archive may remain physically present while becoming unreadable. A future excavation might uncover rows of corroded server racks in a sealed building. They would find cables, metal cases, glass fibers, and storage devices. They might correctly guess that these objects were important. But importance is not the same as comprehension. To them, a hard drive could be like a sealed library with no alphabet. They might find smartphones by the thousands, thin rectangles of glass and metal, their screens dark, their batteries swollen or gone. Some might be preserved in dry places. Some might retain images or text if the right tools still existed. But without the systems that made them useful, these objects could become almost mystical. Small black mirrors carried by nearly every person. Objects that contained voices, faces, maps, money, distant knowledge, and access to invisible communities. How would you explain that to someone who had never seen a network? Perhaps they would create stories. This is not because future people would be foolish. It is because archaeology always works with incomplete evidence. We do it ourselves. We find a carved figure, a strange building, a burial object, and try to reconstruct the minds of people separated from us by centuries. Sometimes we are right, sometimes we are confidently wrong. Future interpreters might decide our logos were religious symbols. They might see corporate towers and assume they were temples to rival gods. A golden arch, a bitten fruit, a four-coloured window, a swoosh on decayed fabric, detached from their original context. These signs could become as mysterious as ancient seals or forgotten royal emblems are to us. They might imagine that our satellites were offerings sent into the sky, and in a way the sky would preserve us too. Thousands of objects now circle Earth, active satellites, abandoned satellites, spent rocket stages, fragments from collisions and explosions. Low orbit is not permanent. Over time, many objects are slowed by the thin upper atmosphere and fall back toward Earth. But higher objects can remain for very long periods. Some may become relics of our age, silent machines passing over a planet that no longer remembers who launched them. Radioactive materials could leave another strange signature. Not everywhere, and not all in the same form. Some radioactive isotopes decay relatively quickly. Others remain detectable over much longer spans of time. Nuclear tests, reactor sites, waste storage facilities, and certain industrial processes may create patterns in soil and rock unlike anything produced by earlier societies. Future scientists might look at those traces and understand something unsettlingly clear. These people had learned to alter matter at its deepest level. They had mastered forces powerful enough to light cities, diagnose disease, explore space, and destroy cities in an instant. And yet they left behind waste. They expected strangers to guard for thousands of years. That may be one of the clearest messages we send into the future. Not a message written in words, but in containment chambers, warning markers, engineered barriers, and places deliberately designed to say, "Do not dig here. Do not drink this water. Do not enter." But even those warnings have a problem. Languages change, symbols lose meaning. A skull and crossbones might be read as danger, or perhaps as a sign of honour, death, protection, or power. A threatening monument could attract attention rather than repel it. The people who designed long-term nuclear warnings understood this difficulty. How do you communicate danger across 10,000 years to people whose language, beliefs, and technology may be completely different? The honest answer is that nobody knows. Every civilization leaves an incomplete message. We leave roads without destinations, towers without workers, machines without instructions, and symbols without explanations. We leave altered rivers, altered forests, altered climates, altered layers of earth. We leave objects so durable that they may outlast the knowledge needed to understand them. And perhaps future people standing among the remains would feel what we feel among ruins now. Not certainty, curiosity, wonder, a little sadness. They would know that we were powerful. They might know that we were numerous. They would see that we transformed the world around us on a scale almost beyond comparison. But the most important question would remain difficult. Did we understand what we were doing? And if they asked that question, They may not be asking only about us. They may be asking about themselves, because the civilization after us may not be a new people arriving from nowhere. It may be us, changed by hardship, carrying forward whatever could be saved. That is what the ruins keep teaching. Civilizations rarely disappear cleanly. Systems fail, cities shrink, trade breaks, and knowledge is lost. But people adapt. They remember seeds, skills, stories, roots, and ways of caring for one another. Complexity gives us power. Resilience gives us time. Inequality can turn pressure into disaster. Memory can turn disaster into a beginning. The eighth civilization is not a confirmed hidden chapter. It is a lens, a way to ask what survives when the familiar world does not. And the answer may depend on ordinary choices made patiently every day. If you enjoyed this journey, please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me where you're listening from. And the best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify through the link in the description.